The 42nd floor of Titan Defense Systems gleamed with steel and glass. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan like the bridge of a warship surveying conquered territory. Victoria Blackwood stood before 8 representatives from the Department of Defense. Her charcoal suit sharp enough to cut contracts, her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who'd learned to command rooms before she could legally drink in them. On the massive screen behind her, lines of code scrolled in luminous green, each algorithm a promise of technological dominance wrapped in the language of national security. The presentation had been rehearsed 17 times, every slide timed, every inflection calibrated. Project Sentinel represented 18 months of her life, compressed into 42 minutes of corporate theater, and the men in uniform sitting across from her held the keys to an $800 million contract that would cement her legacy as something more than Donovan Blackwood's daughter. Nathaniel Garrison pushed his janitorial cart past the boardroom's glass wall, the wheels squeaking against marble that cost more per square foot than his monthly rent. 37 years old when he'd last worn a suit that mattered 42 now, in gray coveralls that made him invisible to everyone who worked above the 20th floor. He'd learned to move through these halls like smoke present but unnoticed, just another piece of the building's infrastructure keeping the machinery of ambition running smooth. His glance through the glass was meant to be cursory, just another empty conference room to clean after the executives finished their theater. But the screen caught his eye. Held it, refused to let go. Code he recognized the way a man recognizes his own handwriting in a letter he'd thought burned years ago. The cart stopped moving. That wasn't possible. That code existed in exactly 3 places: the depths of his memory, the pages of a water-damaged notebook hidden in his apartment, and the servers of Sterling Defense Labs, where it should have been destroyed after the scandal that ended his career. Yet there it glowed on Victoria Blackwood's presentation screen, his architecture stripped and repurposed, dressed up in new variable names like a stolen car with fresh paint. His feet carried him through the door before his mind finished processing the implications. 8 faces turned toward him, expressions shifting from confusion to irritation to alarm in the space of 2 heartbeats. Victoria's mouth opened, some corporate dismissal already forming, but Nathaniel was moving his hands, reaching for the laptop on the presentation table, lifting it, and in one fluid motion that felt like watching someone else's body betray 7 years of careful invisibility, he brought it down against the marble floor. The screen shattered. Circuit boards scattered. A woman screamed, though he couldn't tell if it was Victoria or someone else. The sound lost in the sudden chaos of security flooding the room. His voice came out steady, directed at Victoria alone. "I just saved your life. You don't know that yet." The hands that grabbed him were professional, efficient, pulling his arms behind his back with practiced force. But he didn't resist. The damage was done, the only kind of damage that mattered anymore. Whatever came next, he'd made sure Project Sentinel wouldn't launch today, and today was enough. 5:30 in the morning came like clockwork in the 1-bedroom apartment in Queens, where Nathaniel had learned to measure time in terms of Lily's needs rather than his own ambitions. The alarm never sounded anymore. His body had internalized the rhythm of single parenthood the way soldiers internalize the cadence of their units. Sleep was a luxury measured in 4-hour blocks between Lily's nightmares about the mother she barely remembered, and the anxiety that sometimes woke him at 3 a.m. with the certainty that Catherine's death had been his fault for not seeing the cancer sooner, for not making enough money to afford better doctors, for choosing truth over career security when their daughter needed stability more than principles. The apartment told the story of managed poverty, walls that needed paint, a radiator that clanked through winter nights like a prisoner testing his chains, furniture salvaged from sidewalks and polished until it almost looked intentional. But it was clean. That much he could control. Every surface scrubbed, every dish washed immediately, every toy returned to its designated space. Order imposed on chaos through sheer force of will. Lily's drawings covered one wall in a collage of construction paper and crayon. Robots, mostly angular figures with LED eyes and articulated joints, sketched with the kind of attention to mechanical detail that made Nathaniel's chest tight with pride and grief in equal measure. She'd inherited Catherine's artistic eye and his engineering brain, a combination that would serve her well in a world that valued such things. If he didn't screw it up, if he could keep her fed and housed and believing that her father was still the hero she drew in that one picture. The tall figure in a business suit with "Daddy the Hero" written underneath in letters that wobbled with 7-year-old enthusiasm. Pancakes were a Saturday tradition imported to Monday because Lily had asked. And Nathaniel had learned that saying yes to small requests built the kind of trust that might survive the larger truths she'd have to learn eventually. That her father had been accused of corporate espionage. That her mother had died angry at the universe and frightened for her daughter's future. That the man who made her breakfast and checked her homework had once been someone important enough to lose everything. She emerged from her room already dressed in mismatched socks and a shirt with a robot on it. Her dark hair sleep-wild and her eyes bright with the kind of morning energy that reminded him Catherine had been the same way alive before coffee, animated by some internal engine that 7 years of grief hadn't completely extinguished in their daughter. Her hug was fierce, unself-conscious in the way children hugged before the world taught them to measure affection. "Morning, Dad. Can you help with my circuit project after school?" He crouched to meet her eyes, a habit Catherine had insisted on. Never talk down to her, she'd said. Treat her like a person who matters because someday she'll be one. Pancakes first, then circuits. Deal, deal. She scrambled into her chair, already talking about voltage and resistance in terms that would have impressed his MIT students if he still had students. If he still had anything beyond this small apartment and this brilliant daughter and the certainty that he'd made the right choice even if it had cost him the ability to make any other choices. 7:15 meant the Roosevelt Elementary bus, which meant standing on the corner with Lily while she chattered about her science teacher who let them use real soldering irons under supervision, about her best friend Emma, who'd moved to Connecticut, about the stray cat she wanted to adopt if he would just say yes this one time, please. The bus pulled away with Lily's face pressed to the window, waving until she was out of sight. Nathaniel stood on the empty corner watching the space where she'd been, the morning already feeling longer than it should. 42 years old, MIT doctorate, collecting dust in a drawer. Working nights as a janitor because background checks for technical positions flagged his name like a biohazard warning. And the janitorial company hadn't bothered to look past the fact that he showed up on time and didn't steal office supplies. Mrs. Patricia O'Brien emerged from her corner store with a bag of yesterday's bagels she always saved for him. Her Irish accent still thick after 40 years in New York. "You're looking tired, Nate. Rough night." "Just the usual." He accepted the bagels, knowing she needed to give them more than he needed to take them. "Thanks for watching Lily tonight. I owe you." "You owe me nothing. That girl's a treasure." Patricia's eyes held the kind of knowing that came from raising 5 children as a widow. "You're doing fine by her. Don't let the bastards tell you different." He wanted to believe her. Most days he almost did. 4:45 in the morning painted Victoria Blackwood's penthouse. In the kind of gray light that made Manhattan look fragile, all those towers of glass and ambition revealed as temporary structures built on the same bedrock that had watched empires rise and collapse for centuries. She woke without an alarm because sleep had become a negotiation with anxiety, 4 hours of unconsciousness purchased at the cost of exhaustion deep enough to override the mental catalog of problems demanding her attention. The Peloton waited like a priest in a confessional, ready to absolve the sins of ambition through controlled suffering. 6 miles before breakfast, overnight reports from the London office streaming across the screen while her legs burned and her heart rate climbed into zones her personal trainer called optimal and she called survivable. Revenue up 18% quarter over quarter. Sentinel contract awaiting final Pentagon approval. Stock price holding steady despite the tech sector's broader volatility, numbers she could control, unlike everything else. The photograph on her desk was professionally framed silver, expensive in the way things were expensive when you needed to prove you valued them. Donovan Blackwood in his dress uniform, 4 stars gleaming, standing beside Victoria on her MIT graduation day with his hand on her shoulder and pride in his eyes that she'd spent the next decade trying to live up to. 2 years since the stroke had taken him mid-sentence during a board meeting. His body collapsing like a building losing its foundation, and she'd been the one to find him to hold his hand, while the paramedics worked to watch the light go out behind eyes that had taught her everything about leadership except how to fill the space he'd left behind. The CEO position had been hers within 6 months. Youngest in company history. Her father's daughter ascending to his throne with the board's blessing and their skepticism, every decision she made measured against the legend of Donovan Blackwood's 30-year reign. She'd learned to be ruthless because kindness was interpreted as weakness. Learned to trust numbers because people always disappointed. Learned to keep everyone at arm's length because intimacy was leverage someone could use against you. Her phone buzzed with a message from Dominic Cross, her CTO, and the closest thing she had to a friend in the building. Though she was self-aware enough to know that friendship between a CEO and her direct reports was mostly fiction. "Morning, boss. Today's the day. Pentagon's ready to sign." She typed back, "Don't disappoint me." His response was immediate. "Never have, never will." Victoria stared at those words longer than they deserved, trying to identify the discomfort they triggered. Dominic had been flawless in his 3 years at Titan. Brilliant, charming, politically astute in ways that made corporate navigation look effortless. He'd proposed Project Sentinel, championed it through the development cycle, and delivered exactly what he'd promised: a revolutionary AI system that would make Titan Defense the dominant player in military cybersecurity. So why did his certainty feel like a red flag she couldn't articulate? The memory arrived unbidden, sharp-edged from 7 years of suppression. Sterling Defense Labs in Boston 20, when Nathaniel Garrison had been more than a name in cached web archives. The scandal had made headlines in technical journals, if not mainstream press. Brilliant MIT professor accused of stealing code, corporate espionage, a settlement that ended with non-disclosure agreements and Garrison's disappearance from the industry. But she'd known him before that, had sat in his lecture hall as a sophomore, one of 80 students learning defensive AI systems from a professor who made ethics feel urgent instead of theoretical. She remembered one lecture, specifically October 2017, when he'd outlined something called the LoopX protocol, a vulnerability in AI architecture that could turn defensive systems into weapons. He'd written the formula on the whiteboard, his handwriting precise, and said something that had stuck with her through the years. "If you ever see this pattern in production code, shut it down immediately. Some mistakes are too dangerous to make even once." She'd forgotten him after graduation, the way students forgot most professors once the grade was posted. But standing in her penthouse watching dawn break over the city her father had conquered, Victoria felt the discomfort crystallize into something closer to dread. What if she'd seen that pattern somewhere recently? The holding room on the 15th floor had been designed for exactly this kind of situation: suspected security breaches. Disgruntled employees, the occasional activist who made it past the lobby, white walls, fluorescent lights, a metal table bolted to the floor, and chairs that were uncomfortable by design. Nathaniel sat with his hands cuffed, not because he'd resisted, but because protocols demanded it, and let his mind run through the calculations he'd been avoiding for 7 years. Dominic Cross had taken CipherNet, the project they'd built together at Sterling Defense, and repackaged it as Sentinel. The timeline fit, the architecture matched, which meant the LoopX protocol, the backdoor Dominic had embedded in the original code, was still there, buried under layers of new functionality, but fundamentally unchanged. An $800 million weapons system with a vulnerability that would let anyone with the master key override every defensive protocol and turn America's satellite network into a weapon aimed at itself. He'd tried to stop it once, had gathered evidence, documented the back door, brought it to Sterling's executive team with the naive certainty that truth mattered more than profit. Dominic had been faster, smarter, more ruthless. By the time Nathaniel walked into that meeting, the trap had already been set, evidence planted on his workstation, emails fabricated to show he'd been the one trying to sell access to foreign contractors, a narrative so complete that his protests sounded exactly like the lies a guilty man would tell. The settlement had come with $50,000 and an NDA that prohibited him from discussing CipherNet publicly. He'd signed because Catherine was pregnant and the alternative was bankruptcy and possibly prison. Had watched his career evaporate, his reputation destroyed, his name becoming a cautionary tale whispered in engineering departments. Nathaniel Garrison, the brilliant mind who'd betrayed his country for money. Catherine had believed him. That had mattered more than he'd known how to express. Had stood beside him through the accusations and the settlement and the 2 years of unemployment before the janitorial position at Titan Defense became his best option. Then cancer had taken her and he'd been left with Lily and the bitter knowledge that doing the right thing had cost him everything, while Dominic had walked away clean, waiting for the perfect moment to resurrect his stolen work. The door opened. Victoria Blackwood entered alone, which surprised him. CEOs traveled with entourages, lawyers, security assistants to manage the details of their lives. But she closed the door behind her and pulled out the metal chair across from him, with hands that trembled just slightly enough to tell him she was frightened and trying not to show it. She studied his face for a long moment, her expression cycling through emotions he couldn't quite read. Then, "You're not just a janitor." Not a question. He kept his voice level. "Right now I am. You taught me. MIT 2017. Defensive AI systems. I sat in the back row and asked too many questions about ethics." The memory surfaced slowly, a young woman with sharp eyes and a tendency to interrogate every assumption he presented, pushing back on the comfortable fiction that technology was neutral and implementation determined morality. He'd liked her intensity, the way she refused to accept easy answers. "I remember. You asked how to know when to shut down a project." His throat felt dry. "I said when you know it'll cause harm regardless of what anyone else says about potential benefits." Victoria's hands flattened on the table, palms down. Fingers spread like she was steadying herself against turbulence. "Why are you here? Why does someone with a PhD from MIT work nights, cleaning offices?" "Because I was convicted of corporate espionage 7 years ago. Because no tech company will hire me. Because night shift lets me be home when my daughter wakes up." The words came without inflection, facts delivered like a weather report. Sunny with a chance of permanent professional destruction. Lily, 7 years old. Her mother died 5 years ago. He met her eyes, saw something shift behind them. Recognition maybe, or shared grief. "Catherine, breast cancer stage 4. We found it too late." The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications neither of them wanted to voice. Finally, Victoria said, "You destroyed my laptop because you saw something on the screen." "I saw code I wrote 7 years ago. Code that Dominic Cross stole. Code with a backdoor that will let anyone with the master key control 500 military satellites, including missile defense systems." He leaned forward, chains rattling. "If Sentinel deploys, whoever has that key can shut down America's defenses in under 30 seconds. Victoria's face had gone pale. "Dominic has worked for me for 3 years. He's the most trusted executive I have. 7 years ago, I trusted him too, until I found emails showing he was selling access to CipherNet. I reported it. He destroyed me instead." Nathaniel watched her process this, saw the calculations running behind her eyes. He's done this before, he's doing it again, and this time the stakes are exponentially higher. She stood abruptly, paced to the wall and back energy that needed somewhere to go. "Why should I believe you, a janitor with a criminal record, over my CTO?" "Because you remember my lecture on Lupex protocol. And because if you check Sentinel's code, you'll find that exact pattern embedded in 47 different files." He kept his voice steady despite the fear climbing his spine. "I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to verify what I'm telling you before you hand the Pentagon a weapon they don't know can be turned against them." Victoria's hand went to her throat, fingers touching the delicate gold chain there like a talisman. He recognized the gesture. Her father had worn his medals the same way, touching them when decisions got hard. She was Donovan Blackwood's daughter in that moment, caught between loyalty to her people and responsibility to something larger. When she spoke, her voice carried a different quality, stripped of corporate authority and reduced to something more human. "If I give you access to Sentinel's code, if I let you prove what you're claiming, what do you want in exchange?" "Nothing for myself. Protection for Lily if this goes wrong. If Dominic realizes what we're doing, he won't hesitate to threaten the one thing I can't lose." Victoria nodded slowly. "Lab 7. Midnight tomorrow. I'll arrange access, and Nathaniel..." She paused at the door. "If you're lying, if this is some elaborate revenge scheme, I will bury you so deep you'll never see daylight again." "I know, but I'm not lying." He met her eyes. "And you already know that, or you wouldn't be considering this." She left without responding, but the door closing behind her sounded less like an ending and more like the first move in a game neither of them knew how to win. The tech team's report arrived on Victoria's desk at 6 p.m. after she'd spent 3 hours in meetings that felt like performance art, her mind only half present, while the rest chased implications she couldn't afford to voice. The laptop's solid-state drive had survived the impact data extracted and analyzed by engineers who'd had no idea what they were really looking at. Dr. Margaret Sullivan arrived with the findings, her 58 years and 3 decades at Titan Defense, giving her the authority to close the door without asking. She'd been Donovan Blackwood's lead engineer before Victoria had been old enough to understand what her father did for a living, and she carried herself with the weary competence of someone who'd seen too many brilliant ideas turn into catastrophes. "We recovered 98% of the presentation data." Margaret laid her tablet on Victoria's desk, fingers tapping through screens of code. "But there's something you need to see, the section here buried in Sentinel's core architecture. The style is distinctive, I've seen it before." Victoria's pulse quickened. "Where?" "Sterling Defense 7 years ago. A project called CipherNet that ended in scandal. There was an engineer accused of code theft." Margaret's eyes held knowledge that felt dangerous. "His name was Nathaniel Garrison." The room felt smaller, suddenly walls closing in. "He works here, night shift janitorial staff." Margaret's expression shifted from professional concern to something closer to alarm. The man who destroyed your laptop is the same person who allegedly stole code 7 years ago, and now he's been working in this building for 2 years. She shook her head. Victoria, this is worse than I thought. But Victoria was barely listening, her fingers already pulling up MIT's archived faculty pages, searching for a face she half remembered from a classroom that felt like another lifetime. There, Dr. Nathaniel Garrison, Associate Professor, course listings from 2016 and 2017, including one titled Ethics in Defense Technology. She clicked through to cached lecture materials, found syllabi and reading lists, and one scanned page of handwritten notes that made her breath catch. LoopX Protocol Recursive Vulnerability in AI Defensive Systems. Warning: if detected in production environment, immediate shutdown required. Pattern recognition is critical for early detection. Below the warning was a formula written in Nathaniel's precise hand. The same mathematical architecture she'd just seen in Margaret's tablet embedded in Project Sentinel's code. Like a bomb waiting for someone to input the right sequence. She opened Sentinel's source repository, typed LoopX into the search function, and watched the results populate 47 files containing references to the protocol Nathaniel had warned against 7 years ago. 47 instances of a vulnerability that shouldn't exist, woven through code that Dominic Cross had personally certified as secure. Margaret, I need you to do something without telling anyone, including Dominic. Victoria's voice came out steadier than she felt. Compare CipherNet's original architecture, whatever documentation still exists, against Sentinel's core systems. I need to know how similar they actually are. That's a serious accusation to make against your CTO. It's a question, not an accusation. Can you do it quietly? Margaret studied her for a long moment, then nodded. I'll need 48 hours. You have 24. Midnight in Queens carried a different quality than midnight in Manhattan, less about possibility and more about survival. The streets were quieter here, fewer people with somewhere important to be. Just shift workers and insomniacs and the occasional police cruiser maintaining the fiction of safety through presence. Victoria's Mercedes looked obscene, parked among the Hondas and Toyotas, chrome and leather, announcing wealth in a neighborhood where wealth meant not worrying about next month's rent. She'd driven herself, dismissing her security detail with instructions that would probably cost her a lecture from her head of protection, but which felt necessary for reasons she couldn't articulate. This conversation needed to happen away from cameras and corporate protocols, in the kind of space where truth had room to breathe. The building was exactly what she'd expected, worn but maintained stairs that creaked, hallways that smelled like cooking from a dozen different cultures. 3rd floor apartment 3B. And her knock was answered so quickly she suspected Nathaniel had been waiting by the door. He looked different without the gray coveralls, wearing jeans and a faded MIT t-shirt that had probably been black once before countless washings faded it to charcoal. Older than she remembered from the lecture hall, lines around his eyes that spoke to years of stress no amount of sleep could erase, but his posture was straight, shoulders back, the bearing of someone who'd decided fear was a luxury he couldn't afford. You came. Surprise and something else in his voice. Relief, maybe. I need to understand what I'm dealing with. She stepped inside, taking in the apartment with one sweeping glance. Small, clean, achingly personal in ways that made her penthouse feel like a hotel. Children's drawings covered the walls, robots and rockets rendered in crayon with the kind of careful attention that suggested a mind already grappling with complex systems. Your daughter's work. Lily has her mother's artistic eye and my engineering brain. Dangerous combination. He closed the door, gestured toward a worn couch that looked salvaged but well-maintained. Mrs. O'Brien next door is watching her. We can talk. A young voice called from the kitchen. Dad, is that the lady from the elevator? Victoria froze. The girl who emerged was 7 years old in that way that meant she'd be 8 soon, all limbs and energy and dark eyes that held Catherine's ghost if the photograph on the mantel was accurate. She wore pajamas with robots on them and carried what looked like a half-finished circuit board, wires trailing like tentacles. Her smile was unself-conscious, delighted. You're the lady who said she only knows how to fix broken contracts. Did you ever learn about robots? The question caught Victoria off guard, piercing through layers of corporate armor to hit something softer underneath. She crouched down, meeting Lily's eyes the way she'd watched her father meet soldiers' eyes, person to person without the weight of rank. You know what I think sometimes fixing the important broken things teaches you how to fix everything else. Lily considered this seriously, then nodded. That makes sense. Dad says everything's connected if you look at the system right. Mrs. Patricia O'Brien appeared in the kitchen doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel, her expression knowing in the way of women who'd raised children and seen every variation of human drama. I'll take Miss Lily back to my place for a bit, give you two some time to talk. Nathaniel mouthed, "Thank you," as the old woman shepherded Lily out, but his daughter stopped at the door, turning back with sudden intensity. You're going to help my dad, right? He's really good at fixing things even when people say they're broken forever. Victoria's throat tightened unexpectedly. I'm going to try. When they were alone, Nathaniel moved to a bookshelf and retrieved a leather-bound notebook. Its edges burned black and pages water-stained, like it had survived a fire and a flood in sequence. He laid it on the coffee table between them with the reverence people usually reserved for religious texts. This is CipherNet's original design. I saved it when Sterling Defense fired me, hid it from the settlement negotiations because I knew someday someone would need proof of what Dominic had done. His fingers traced the burned edge. House fire 2 years ago, electrical fault in the building's wiring. This was the only thing I went back in to save. Victoria opened the notebook carefully, mindful of its fragility. The pages were filled with handwritten code diagrams, mathematical proofs laid out with the precision of someone who thought in symbols. And there, midway through a section labeled Loop X Protocol Critical Vulnerability, Do Not Implement. This is the backdoor Dominic added without telling me. I discovered it during testing 3 days before our presentation to the Pentagon. He called it an optimization feature, said it was necessary for maintenance access. Nathaniel's voice had gone flat, the tone people used when recounting trauma they'd processed but not resolved. I didn't believe him. Ran deeper analysis and found emails proving he'd already negotiated a sale to foreign contractors. $15 million for the master key once CipherNet deployed. You reported it, directly to the CEO, walked in with printouts and evidence and the naive certainty that truth mattered more than money. His laugh was bitter tired. Dominic had already planted counter-evidence on my workstation. By the time I left that meeting, I was the one accused of trying to sell secrets. The company offered a settlement to avoid publicity, $50,000 and an NDA that prohibited me from ever discussing CipherNet again. Victoria forced herself to ask the next question, though part of her already knew the answer. Why sign if you were innocent? Because Catherine was pregnant. Because the alternative was bankruptcy and criminal charges. Because I thought if I stayed quiet, kept my head down, I could rebuild somewhere else eventually. He met her eyes, and she saw something there that looked like surrender that had curdled into determination. I was wrong, but by the time I realized it, Catherine was dying and Lily needed stability more than she needed a father playing hero. The notebook lay open between them, damning in its detail. Victoria pulled out her phone, comparing the handwritten protocols against the screenshots she'd taken of Sentinel's code. The match was undeniable, not just in concept, but in implementation, the kind of similarity that only happened when someone copied homework and changed just enough variables to avoid obvious detection. Dominic took your work, waited 7 years, and brought it to Titan with a new name. Not a question. The evidence made questions obsolete. The architecture is mine, the back door is his, and Sentinel is worse than CipherNet ever was. Nathaniel opened his laptop, old screen-cracked keyboard worn smooth from use, and pulled up simulation data that made Victoria's stomach drop. CipherNet controlled 200 satellites. Sentinel controls 500, including missile defense systems. If someone has the master key, they can shut down American defenses in under 30 seconds, and the AI will report everything's functioning normally while enemy systems have free rein. The implications cascaded through her mind like dominoes. $800 million invested in a weapons system that was actually a weapon aimed at itself. Her name attached to a project that could trigger the exact catastrophe. It was designed to prevent Dominic Cross sitting in her C-suite orchestrating the whole thing with the same patient competence he'd shown her for 3 years. She'd trusted him, had believed his brilliance was genuine rather than parasitic, had let him guide strategic decisions because his track record was flawless and his confidence absolute. How many other decisions had he influenced? How many other systems at Titan Defense might be compromised by code she hadn't personally verified? I need you to help me audit Sentinel completely, every line, every function, every embedded protocol. Her hands were shaking now, adrenaline and fear mixing into something that felt like clarity. If you're right, we shut it down. If you're wrong, I'm not wrong. But yes, I'll help. Nathaniel closed the laptop. One condition: if Dominic realizes what we're doing, if he comes after me again, you protect Lily. She's 7 years old. She's already lost her mother. I won't let my mistakes cost her everything else. Victoria thought about her father, about the weight of legacy and the price of moral certainty. Donovan Blackwood had taught her that leadership meant making hard choices, but he'd never explained what to do when every choice looked like walking into fire. She extended her hand across the coffee table, formal in a way that felt important. I promise. Whatever happens, Lily will be safe. His handshake was firm, calloused from physical labor, and holding it made Victoria aware of how soft her own hands had become, manicured and moisturized and utterly unprepared for the work ahead. As she drove back to Manhattan, the city lights blurring through her windshield, Victoria didn't notice the black sedan parked 3 cars behind her building's entrance windows. Tinted dark engine idling. Inside, Dominic Cross lowered his phone, the photographs he'd taken clear enough to show Victoria entering and leaving Nathaniel Garrison's apartment building. His smile was cold, calculated, the expression of someone who'd played this game before and knew exactly how it ended. He sent a single text message to his assistant. Schedule emergency board meeting, security breach, tomorrow 2 p.m. Then he deleted the message, encrypted the photos, and drove home through streets that carried his secrets like the city carried everyone's secrets, buried but never quite forgotten. Waiting for the right pressure to force them back to the surface. Lab 7 occupied an entire floor of Titan Defense that had been abandoned 3 years ago when the company pivoted from hardware development to pure software, the kind of corporate evolution that left behind expensive equipment and empty rooms like archaeological strata marking extinctions. The lights still worked, the workstations still booted, but dust covered everything, and the whiteboard held equations from projects nobody remembered anymore, ghosts of innovation that hadn't quite worked. Nathaniel arrived first, 20 minutes early, because punctuality had been drilled into him at MIT, and 7 years of janitorial work hadn't erased the habit. He set up 2 workstations side by side, positioning the monitors for collaborative work, his movements economical from years of making do with whatever space he could find. The leather notebook went on the table between them, open to the section detailing CipherNet's core architecture, a roadmap for proving what Dominic had stolen. Victoria entered at 12:30 a.m., exactly carrying a secure USB drive that held Sentinel's complete source repository, every line of code that had consumed 18 months of Titan Defense's best engineers, and $800 million in Pentagon funding. She'd changed from her suit into jeans and an MIT sweatshirt that looked older than her career, comfortable clothes for work that would take all night and possibly destroy everything she'd built. They didn't speak immediately. There was an understanding between them now, formed in Nathaniel's cramped apartment over a burned notebook and a 7-year-old girl's innocent faith in broken things being fixable. Victoria plugged in the USB drive. Nathaniel booted his laptop alongside it, and they began the methodical work of comparing code line by line, function by function, looking for the patterns that would prove theft or exonerate a man she desperately wanted to trust. 2 hours passed in near silence, broken only by keyboard clicks and occasional observations. Nathaniel would point to a section in his notebook. Victoria would pull up the corresponding Sentinel code, and the match would be undeniable. Not just similar, identical down to the variable naming conventions and comment structure, the kind of similarity that only happened through direct copying. This section here, Nathaniel highlighted a function buried deep in Sentinel's defensive protocols. It's supposed to optimize response time to incoming threats. But look at the recursive call structure. It creates a loop that can be triggered by specific external input. Victoria traced the code with her finger, following the logic through nested conditionals that spiraled inward like a trap waiting to spring. And if someone knows the exact sequence, they bypass every safety check. The AI thinks it's optimizing when it's actually executing commands from an external source. He pulled up his laptop, ran a simulation that showed the exploit in action, green indicators showing normal operation while in the background. Control transferred to a source outside the system. This is LoopX. This is what I warned about 7 years ago. She ran her own search through Sentinel's codebase, typing LoopX into the repository search and watching results populate 47 files scattered throughout the system. Like mines in a field, each one a potential entry point for someone who knew what they were looking for. Dominic didn't just steal your work, he improved it. The realization made her nauseous. CipherNet's backdoor was hidden but detectable. This version adapts to audits, disguises itself as legitimate optimization code. You'd have to know exactly what you're looking for to find it. Which means either Dominic is planning to sell access again, or Nathaniel stopped, his face going pale. Or he already has buyers waiting. Victoria finished the thought, understanding crashing over her like cold water. He's been at Titan for 3 years. Project Sentinel has been in development for 18 months. That's plenty of time to negotiate sales, set up transfers, arrange everything so that the moment we deploy to Pentagon systems, whoever holds the master key has control. The implications branched in her mind like a decision tree, each path leading to catastrophe. If they shut down Sentinel now, Titan Defense would lose the Pentagon contract and possibly face investigation for proposing a compromised system. If they let it deploy, they'd be complicit in creating the exact vulnerability it was designed to prevent. If they went public with accusations against Dominic, they'd need evidence stronger than code comparisons and the testimony of a man already convicted of corporate espionage. We need to find the master key. Nathaniel was already typing, pulling up tracing protocols that Victoria recognized from her own MIT education. Dominic had to store it somewhere accessible. He's too smart to keep it on company servers, but he needs it close enough to execute the sale. They worked through the early morning hours, coffee growing cold on the table. the city beyond the windows shifting from darkness to that gray pre-dawn light that made everything look temporary. Victoria found herself watching Nathaniel work, noticing things she'd missed in her own education, the way he annotated his process, explaining each step like he was still teaching a classroom, the care he took to verify assumptions before building on them, the underlying current of ethical consideration that ran through every technical decision. This was what she'd been missing. Not just the technical skill Titan had engineers as talented as anyone in the industry, but the framework that put technical excellence in service of something larger than profit or innovation for its own sake. Her father had understood this, had built Titan Defense on the principle that defense contractors had moral obligations beyond shareholder returns. Somewhere along the way, chasing his legacy, she'd forgotten to ask whether the projects she championed actually served the mission or just looked good in quarterly reports. At 4 a.m, Nathaniel's tracing program returned results that made them both lean forward, exhaustion forgotten. There, he highlighted a string of encrypted data pointing to a cloud storage location registered under corporate credentials. The master key is stored on Dominic's personal device, backed up to an encrypted partition that's technically outside Titan's network, but accessible through his company login. Can we access it? Not without triggering alerts that would tell him we're looking. Nathaniel ran parameters through the simulation, testing different approach vectors. But we can prove it exists, document the connection, build a case that shows intent. The lights in the hallway outside suddenly blazed to life, footsteps approaching with purpose. Victoria and Nathaniel froze, eyes meeting in shared understanding. They'd been careful, but not careful enough. Someone knew they were here. The door opened. Dominic Cross stood in the threshold, flanked by 2 security guards. His expression carrying the kind of cold satisfaction that came from springing a trap you'd been building for days. He was dressed in business casual, despite the hour, like he'd been awake all along, waiting for exactly this moment. "Working late, Victoria?" His voice was pleasant, conversational, the tone of someone who'd already won. "And with our friend Nathaniel. How industrious." Dominic's smile carried the weight of preparation, that particular smugness of someone who'd anticipated every move on the board and positioned his pieces accordingly. He stepped into Lab 7 with the casual authority of ownership, the 2 security guards fanning out behind him like well-trained extensions of his will. The overhead lights painted harsh shadows across workstations that suddenly felt like crime scenes awaiting documentation. His eyes moved from the open laptop to the leather notebook to the USB drive still plugged into Victoria's workstation, cataloging evidence, with the efficiency of a prosecutor building an airtight case. "I have to admit, Victoria, I didn't expect you to move quite this fast. 24 hours from smashed laptop to midnight conspiracy. That's impressive operational security, almost impressive enough." Victoria stood slowly, positioning herself between Dominic and Nathaniel in a gesture that felt more instinctive than strategic. Her voice came out level despite the adrenaline spiking through her system. "This isn't what it looks like. Really, because it looks like my CEO is colluding with a convicted corporate spy to access classified code without proper authorization." Dominic pulled out his phone, tapping through screens with practiced ease. "Protocol 7B is very clear. Any access to source repositories requires CTO approval in writing. You violated company security policy, Victoria. That's not something I can ignore regardless of our professional relationship." Nathaniel had gone still in that way people did when they recognized predators circling every muscle tense, but movement suspended, waiting for the moment to break or stay frozen. His fingers remained on the keyboard as if one more command might salvage something from the wreckage of their investigation. "We found Loop X." Victoria kept her voice steady, refusing to be intimidated by procedures Dominic was weaponizing. 47 instances of a backdoor protocol embedded in Sentinel's code. The same protocol Nathaniel warned Sterling Defense about 7 years ago. Dominic's expression shifted to something that approximated concern, an actor's approximation of worry performed for the security guards witnessing this confrontation. LoopX is a theoretical optimization framework. Multiple researchers have explored similar concepts. The fact that Nathaniel recognizes patterns he studied doesn't constitute theft. The variable names are identical. The comment structure matches line for line. The recursive functions are exact copies of code Nathaniel wrote in 20. Victoria gestured at the workstation where comparisons still glowed on the screen. This isn't convergent evolution, this is plagiarism. Interesting theory. Except Nathaniel Garrison was convicted of stealing code from Sterling Defense 7 years ago. His credibility as a witness is, shall we say, compromised. Dominic's tone stayed pleasant, reasonable, the voice of sanity confronting paranoia. What we have here is a disgraced engineer with an axe to grind manipulating a CEO who's understandably eager to prove herself beyond her father's shadow. It's tragic, really. The words hit Victoria like physical blows, each one calibrated to exploit exactly the vulnerabilities she'd been fighting since Donovan Blackwood's death. Her need to prove herself, her fear of failing the legacy, her isolation that made manipulation easier because there was no one left to provide perspective. Nathaniel finally moved, standing in a motion that drew the security guard's attention. Hands visible, posture non-threatening despite the anger burning behind his eyes. I was never convicted. Sterling Defense settled to avoid publicity. There's a difference. Is there? Dominic's smile widened fractionally. Tell me, Nathaniel, what exactly did that settlement prohibit you from discussing? Was it perhaps the details of CipherNet? The specific code you're now claiming to recognize in Sentinel? The trap closed with beautiful precision. Nathaniel's face drained of color as he understood the position Dominic had engineered, even defending himself, would violate the NDA that had been part of his settlement. Speaking publicly about CipherNet's architecture would give Sterling Defense grounds to sue, possibly criminally prosecute and destroy any credibility his testimony might otherwise carry. Victoria saw the calculation running behind Nathaniel's eyes, watched him weigh truth against legal exposure, and realized he'd been checkmated before the game began. Dominic had been playing this round for 7 years, waiting for the moment when Nathaniel's conscience would overcome his caution, ready to deploy the same weapons that had worked perfectly the first time. The board meeting is scheduled for 2 p.m. today. Dominic delivered the information like a gift, generosity masking the blade underneath. I'll be presenting evidence of security breaches and recommending appropriate responses. Victoria, you'll have the opportunity to explain your decision-making process. I'm sure the board will be very interested in hearing your rationale for giving a man with Nathaniel's history unrestricted access to our most sensitive project. He turned to the security guards, nodding toward the workstations. Seal this lab. Confiscate all equipment. Nothing leaves this room without my written authorization. And ensure Dr. Garrison vacates the building. His employment at Titan Defense is terminated effective immediately. The guards moved with bureaucratic efficiency, disconnecting cables, logging serial numbers, transforming collaborative workspace into evidence repository. Nathaniel stood motionless as they collected his laptop, the notebook he'd saved from fire, the years of documentation that had seemed like insurance against exactly this scenario. Victoria's mind raced through options that all felt equally catastrophic. She could invoke executive authority, override Dominic's orders, but that would only accelerate the board confrontation without giving her time to build a proper defense. She could go public immediately, but accusations without evidence would destroy Titan's reputation and her own credibility. She could back down, let Dominic win this round, but that meant Sentinel would deploy with its vulnerabilities intact, and whatever Dominic had planned would proceed unchallenged. "Dominic, we need to discuss this privately before involving the board." Her voice carried the command she'd cultivated over 2 years of CEO experience, the authority that came from believing you deserved to be heard. "I disagree. This is exactly the kind of situation that requires board oversight." His expression was sympathetic now, concern for her well-being layered over the triumph underneath. "Victoria, you're exhausted. You've been under tremendous pressure since your father passed. No one would fault you for making a judgment error under those circumstances. The board will understand." The condescension was almost artful in its precision, designed to make her look unstable while maintaining his appearance of loyal concern. He was offering her an exit admit to stress-induced poor judgment. Accept a graceful stepping back from day-to-day operations, let him handle the difficult business of running the company while she recovered from grief that had clearly impaired her decision-making. She could see exactly how this would play out in the boardroom. Dominic's calm recitation of events, the CEO granting unauthorized access to classified systems, trusting a convicted criminal over her CTO's explicit warnings, risking an $800 million contract on the paranoid accusations of a disgraced engineer. The narrative wrote itself, and every element was technically true, even as the larger truth drowned beneath corporate protocols and careful framing. Nathaniel met her eyes across the confiscated workstations, and in that look, Victoria saw something that steadied her lurching thoughts. Not hope exactly, but determination that had survived worse than this. He'd lost everything once and rebuilt a life from janitorial work and single parenthood in the certainty that his daughter's future mattered more than his pride. He was still standing, still fighting, still refusing to let Dominic's victory be permanent. "I'll be at that board meeting." Victoria's words came out harder than intended, shaped by anger she didn't bother to mask. "And I'll have evidence to present, real evidence, not just protocols and procedures weaponized against the people trying to protect this company." Dominic's smile finally showed teeth, the predator's amusement at prey that didn't understand it was already dead. "I look forward to it. 2 p.m. Victoria. Don't be late." He left with the security guards, taking with him every physical record of their investigation, leaving Victoria and Nathaniel standing in an empty lab that suddenly felt like a tomb for good intentions. The silence stretched long enough that Victoria's ears started ringing. Finally, Nathaniel spoke, his voice carrying a flatness that suggested shock hadn't fully receded. He knew, the whole time, he's been waiting for this. For 7 years. Victoria moved to the window, looking down at Manhattan, beginning its morning routine 40 floors below, all those people moving through lives that didn't depend on whether she made the right choice in the next 6 hours. He let you work here, knew exactly where you were, probably tracked every move you made. The moment I started investigating, he was ready. I underestimated him. Again. Nathaniel's hands clenched and unclenched, working through frustration that had nowhere productive to go. That settlement wasn't just about silencing me. It was about making sure if I ever tried to speak up again, I'd be legally prohibited from defending myself. Victoria turned from the window, mind shifting into the kind of strategic thinking her father had drilled into her since childhood. Battles weren't won by dwelling on disadvantages. They were won by finding asymmetries the enemy hadn't anticipated, by turning their certainty into overconfidence. "We don't have the workstations. We don't have your documentation. What do we have that Dominic doesn't know about?" Nathaniel's eyes widened slightly, understanding, catching up. "You're not backing down. I'm not letting him deploy a compromised system because he outmaneuvered us in Lab 7. She started pacing, energy finding direction. "We have 6 hours before the board meeting. What can we prove in 6 hours that doesn't depend on physical evidence he's already confiscated?" The question hung between them, too large and too urgent, the kind of problem that would have taken her MIT professors weeks to properly frame, let alone solve. But Nathaniel had been teaching ethics in defense technology when solving impossible problems was what his students paid tuition for, and something in his expression suggested he was already running calculations. The master key. His voice picked up speed as the idea crystallized. Dominic has to keep it accessible. He's too smart to store it only on company systems. But he needs it available to execute whatever sale he's planning. If we can prove the key exists, show the board that there's an actual backdoor control mechanism rather than just theoretical vulnerabilities, they'd have to take the threat seriously regardless of who's making the accusation. Victoria finished the thought, feeling the first stirrings of something that might have been hope if she let herself examine it too closely. But you said accessing it would trigger alerts. Accessing it directly, yes. But there are other ways to prove something exists. Nathaniel was already moving toward the door, toward whatever came next. I need my apartment. Specifically, I need the backup I made before coming to Lab 7. Victoria checked her watch, 4:30 a.m. The board meeting was in 9.5 hours, which meant they had maybe 7 hours of productive work time before she'd need to prep her presentation. Your daughter will be awake in 90 minutes. Lily wakes up at 6, which gives us enough time if we move now. He paused at the threshold, looking back at the empty lab where their investigation had died before it could prove anything. Victoria, if we do this, if we keep pushing, Dominic won't just discredit us professionally. He'll come after everything I have left, my custody of Lily, my ability to work anywhere. He'll make sure I'm not just unemployed, but unemployable, possibly facing criminal charges for violating the NDA. I know. She met his eyes, making sure he saw she understood the stakes and was choosing to proceed anyway. But if we don't stop him, Sentinel deploys, and whatever he's planned happens to people who don't even know they're at risk. Nathaniel nodded slowly, some decision solidifying behind his expression. Catherine used to say that doing the right thing shouldn't require permission. You just do it and deal with consequences after. His smile was sad, remembering someone who'd believed in him when no one else did. I'm not letting her be wrong about that. They left Lab 7 together, moving through empty corridors where night shift maintenance crews were finishing their rounds and early arriving executives were still hours away. Victoria's mind was already churning through the next steps, the way she'd need to present their case. The board members who might be sympathetic versus those already in Dominic's pocket through years of relationship building. She'd been too focused on quarterly results to prioritize. The parking garage felt cavernous at this hour, their footsteps echoing off concrete and steel. Victoria's Mercedes sat alone in the executive section, chrome and leather, looking out of place next to empty yellow lines stretching into shadow. She hit the unlock button, then stopped as instinct triggered some warning she couldn't quite articulate. Wait. Nathaniel's hand on her arm, gentle but urgent. Look at the car. She followed his gaze, scanning the Mercedes for whatever had caught his attention. Their driver's side rear tire sitting lower than it should, rubber pressed against pavement in a way that suggested air loss rather than just weight distribution. They circled the vehicle slowly. All 4 tires were flat, not blown, but deflated with enough precision that it had to be deliberate. No visible damage to the car itself, no broken windows or scratched paint. Just enough sabotage to strand them here without being obviously criminal. He's escalating. Nathaniel's voice was quiet, controlled, but Victoria heard the fear underneath. This is a message. He wants us to know he can reach us anywhere, that there's no move we can make he hasn't already anticipated. Victoria pulled out her phone, fingers hovering over the call function, running through options. Building security would take an hour to respond at this hour, and calling them would mean explaining why they'd been in Lab 7 at 4 a.m. A tow truck would take just as long. Uber or Lyft would work but would leave a digital trail showing her traveling to Nathaniel's address in Queens, more evidence for Dominic to weaponize in the board meeting. My car's 3 blocks away. Nathaniel was already moving toward the garage exit. Old Honda I bought after Catherine died. It's not much, but it runs. They walked through streets that were transitioning from night to morning, the city's metabolism shifting gears as delivery trucks began their routes and early commuters emerged from subway stations. Victoria felt exposed in ways she hadn't experienced in years, all her usual insulation stripped away. No driver, no security detail, no executive authority to smooth interactions with a world that didn't care about quarterly earnings or corporate hierarchies. Nathaniel's Honda was exactly what she'd expected, 15 years old. Faded blue paint passenger door that required specific jiggling to open properly. The interior smelled like coffee and crayons, a child's car seat in back, surrounded by library books about robotics and engineering. This was the vehicle of someone who'd been stripped down to essentials and found a way to keep moving anyway. The drive to Queens took 40 minutes through traffic that was already building bridges and tunnels, filling with people heading into Manhattan to feed the machine that had chewed Nathaniel up and was currently digesting Victoria's career in real time. She watched the city slide past the window, all those buildings that had seemed like monuments to achievement, reframed as temporary constructions built on sand foundations. Nothing permanent about them except the certainty that they'd eventually collapse. You're thinking about your father. Nathaniel's observation cut through her spiral with uncomfortable accuracy. He built Titan Defense from nothing. 40 years of work, and I'm going to lose it in a board meeting because I trusted the wrong person. Victoria kept her eyes on the passing buildings, not ready to face the sympathy she'd see in Nathaniel's expression. He told me once that the hardest part of leadership was accepting that you'd make mistakes that cost other people everything. I thought I understood. I didn't. Donovan Blackwood also taught ethics at West Point. I read his lectures when I was developing my own curriculum. Nathaniel navigated around a delivery truck, the Honda's engine laboring slightly at the acceleration. He had this line about integrity being the thing you couldn't afford to lose no matter what else you sacrificed. You're living that right now. Easy to say when you're not the one sacrificing. The words came out harsher than she intended, shaped by exhaustion and fear she was trying not to examine. I lost my career, my reputation, and my wife. I'm raising a daughter in an apartment that's one emergency away from eviction, working jobs that don't require background checks, and in about 3 hours Dominic is going to finish destroying whatever's left of my ability to support her. Nathaniel's voice stayed level, factual, but Victoria heard the weight behind the words. I know exactly what sacrifice costs. I also know that living with yourself after making the wrong choice costs more. They reached his building as the first real light of morning painted the eastern sky hot and pink, that brief window when even Queens looked almost beautiful. Mrs. O'Brien was already awake, sitting on the front stoop with a cup of tea and the morning paper, her presence both guardian and witness. She looked up as they approached, her Irish eyes sharp despite the early hour. Lily's still asleep. Been checking on her every 30 minutes like you asked. Her gaze moved to Victoria, assessment without judgment. You're the CEO, the one on the news standing next to that slick fellow with the nice suits. Dominic Cross, my CTO. Victoria found herself wanting this old woman's approval in ways that made no strategic sense. He's not what he appears to be. Most people aren't, dear. That's why you pay attention to what they do when no one important is watching. Patricia stood brushing off her dress with work-worn hands. Nate's a good man, good father. You could do worse for allies when the fighting gets real. Inside the apartment, Nathaniel moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd learned to work around a sleeping child. retrieving his old laptop from a kitchen drawer where it had been hidden under dish towels and spare batteries. He booted it up, fingers moving across the keyboard with muscle memory, pulling up files that represented his only remaining insurance policy. Before we went to Lab 7, I made a complete backup of our analysis. Everything we documented about the code comparison, the loopx instances, the tracing we'd done on the master key location. He pulled up a directory tree that branched into dozens of subdirectories, gigabytes of evidence. Dominic has the physical hardware, but he doesn't have this, and this is enough to build a presentation that shows the board what we found. Victoria pulled up a chair, looking at the screen with fresh eyes. The data was comprehensive side-by-side code comparisons, architectural diagrams showing how loopx integrated with Sentinel's defensive protocols, simulation data, demonstrating how the backdoor could be exploited. It was the kind of documentation that would have taken weeks to compile if they were starting from scratch. But Nathaniel had built it methodically through the night, anticipating exactly this scenario. You knew we'd lose the lab. Not a question. I hoped we wouldn't, but I've played against Dominic before. Nathaniel pulled up a particular file, one that showed email metadata tracing back to Sterling Defense. He's brilliant at controlling the terrain. The only way to beat him is to have resources he doesn't know exist. Catherine taught me that too. Always have a backup, always have an exit strategy, always protect what you can't afford to lose. They spent the next hour transferring the most critical files to Victoria's phone, building a streamlined presentation that would work within the board's attention span and patience. Nathaniel annotated each piece of evidence, explaining what it showed and why it mattered, translating technical details into language that would make sense to executives who understood business better than code. At 6 a.m., Lily emerged from her bedroom in robot pajamas, hair sleep-wild and eyes still half closed. She stopped when she saw Victoria processing the unexpected presence with 7-year-old directness. You came back. Does that mean you're helping? Victoria crouched down, meeting Lily's eyes the way her father had taught her to meet anyone's eyes, regardless of age or rank. I'm trying to help your dad with something important, but it's complicated. Dad says complicated just means you have to work harder to understand all the pieces. Lily climbed into Nathaniel's lap with the unself-conscious affection of children who knew they were loved. Are you going to fire him? Some of the kids at school said their parents got fired and had to move away. The question hit Victoria in ways she hadn't armored herself against. This child's entire world hung on decisions being made in boardrooms she'd never see by people who'd never meet her, who'd reduce her father to a line item in risk assessment matrices that didn't account for robots drawn in crayon or pancakes made every morning regardless of how tired you were. No one's firing your dad, I promise. The words came out before Victoria could calculate whether she could actually keep that promise. But looking at Lily's face, hope mixed with the kind of preemptive grief children learned when stability was always temporary. She committed to making it true through whatever means necessary. Nathaniel made pancakes while Victoria and Lily talked about robots and engineering and what made code good versus bad. Lily had theories. Good code was like Legos, where all the pieces fit together perfectly. Bad code was when you tried to force pieces that didn't match, and everything fell apart eventually. Her 7-year-old metaphor was more accurate than most technical documentation Victoria had reviewed. At 7:15, they walked Lily to the bus stop, Nathaniel holding his daughter's hand, while Victoria followed a half-step behind, aware she was intruding on routine that had existed long before she'd smashed into their lives with corporate intrigue and moral crises. Lily waved from the bus window until it turned the corner, and Nathaniel stood watching the empty street with an expression that suggested this moment happened exactly the same way every morning and mattered exactly as much every time. If we lose today, if Dominic succeeds in discrediting both of us completely, what happens to her? Victoria asked the question that had been building since Lab 7, since the flattened tires. Since understanding how thoroughly Dominic had prepared for this confrontation. Mrs. O'Brien would take her temporarily. After that, Nathaniel's voice trailed off, leaving implications hanging in morning air that suddenly felt heavier. There's no family left. Catherine's parents died before we met. Mine disowned me after the Sterling defense scandal. So it would be foster care probably, unless I can prove I have stable income and housing, which becomes impossible if Dominic destroys what's left of my reputation. Victoria had grown up with trust funds and private schools, with the certainty that even if everything went wrong, there would be safety nets woven from her father's connections and the Blackwood name's residual power. Lily had none of that. She had a father who'd sacrificed everything for principles Victoria had claimed to value but never tested. And she had a precarious present that could evaporate if the wrong people made the wrong decisions in the wrong boardroom. He's not going to win. Victoria heard the certainty in her own voice, felt it solidifying into something harder than mere determination. Whatever it takes, whatever I have to sacrifice, Dominic doesn't get to destroy your family. Because he's good at corporate manipulation. They returned to the apartment, spreading their evidence across every flat surface building and rebuilding the presentation that would have to convince 7 board members that their CTO was not just wrong, but actively malicious. The documentation was solid, the code comparisons undeniable, but Victoria kept circling back to the same problem. Why would the board believe a CEO they'd been skeptical of from her first day versus a CTO who'd never given them reason to doubt at 9 a.m.? Victoria's phone rang. The caller ID showed Harrison Matthews, chair of Titan Defense's board and her father's closest friend for 30 years. She answered with trepidation mixed with hope. If Harrison was calling personally, it meant the board meeting was already casting shadows ahead of itself. His voice came through rough with age and what might have been disappointment. Victoria, Dominic sent preliminary briefing materials, security breach, unauthorized access, conspiracy with a convicted criminal. Tell me this isn't what it looks like. It's not what it looks like. It's worse and better than that. She chose honesty over spin, trusting that Harrison's loyalty to her father might translate into listening rather than prejudging. Sentinel has a back door, a deliberate vulnerability that will let anyone with the master key control our entire defensive network. Dominic embedded it in the code and he destroyed the man who tried to stop him 7 years ago. Now he's trying to destroy me for discovering it. Silence stretched long enough that Victoria thought the connection had dropped. Finally, those are serious accusations. Do you have proof? Yes. Independent forensic analysis, code comparisons, documentation showing systematic plagiarism and intentional security compromise. She pulled up the files on her screen, watching data she'd spent the night compiling. I need the board to see the evidence before deciding based on Dominic's narrative. The meeting starts at 2 p.m. I'll make sure you have time to present. Harrison's voice carried the weight of decisions that would ripple beyond the boardroom. But Victoria, if you're wrong about this, if you're making accusations you can't substantiate, the board will have no choice but to remove you as CEO. You understand that? I understand. The words felt like stepping off a cliff, hoping the ground would catch her, or at least that the fall would matter. Thank you, Harrison. She ended the call and looked at Nathaniel, who'd been listening from across the room. We have the board's attention. Now we have to convince them. The hours before the meeting blurred together in a marathon of preparation that felt both urgent and futile. They rehearsed arguments, anticipated objections, built backup slides for every contingency they could imagine. Victoria called in favors from other executives, confirmed that Dr. Margaret Sullivan would be available to testify about the code. Similarities arranged for the independent forensic expert who'd verified their findings to be on standby via video conference. At noon, Victoria's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You should know I have photographs of you entering and leaving Garrison's apartment last night. Interesting optics for a CEO. Perhaps we could discuss alternatives to this unpleasantness at the board meeting. D." The message was elegant in its threat, offering her an exit while making clear exactly how far Dominic was prepared to go. He was suggesting she could preserve her reputation by backing down, letting him handle the Sentinel deployment, accepting some face-saving compromise that would leave him in control, and her neutered as a figurehead CEO focused on quarterly earnings rather than actual corporate direction. She showed the message to Nathaniel, watched his expressions cycle through anger and resignation. "He's giving you an out. Take it. Protect yourself. Lily and I will survive somehow." "No." Victoria deleted the message without responding. "We've come too far, and even if I wanted to back down, I've seen what Sentinel can do. I can't let that deploy just to protect my career." At 1:30 p.m., Victoria stood in front of her closet in the apartment she'd barely slept in for 3 days, choosing clothes for a board meeting that would determine whether she was CEO or unemployed by dinner time. She selected her father's favorite suit, charcoal gray with subtle pinstripes, the one she'd worn to his funeral, and hadn't been able to touch since. It felt like armor and memorial both weight on her shoulders that reminded her why the fight mattered. Nathaniel waited in her living room wearing the same suit he'd worn to Lab 7, slightly worn at the elbows, but clean and pressed. He looked like what he was, someone who'd lost everything once and rebuilt with dignity, who'd chosen principle over comfort so many times it had become reflex rather than decision. They drove to Titan Defense in silence, Victoria's replacement Mercedes making the trip in 20 minutes that felt both too long and too short. The building rose above them in glass and steel, monument to her father's vision and her inheritance. And she felt the weight of potential loss in ways that transcended mere career concerns. This building represented 40 years of ethical defense contracting, of trying to build weapon systems that actually protected rather than just generating profit. If Dominic won, if Sentinel deployed with its vulnerabilities intact, that entire legacy became fiction. The 45th floor boardroom had been designed to intimidate floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan, from a height that made cars look like toys and people vanish entirely. The conference table was carved from single piece of black walnut seats arranged to give the chairman clear sight lines to everyone, while positioning the CEO at the opposite end in a throne that invited challenge. 7 board members were already seated when Victoria entered, their expressions ranging from concern to hostility to the careful neutrality of people waiting to see which way wind blew before committing. Harrison Matthews sat at the head of the table, 72 years old, with the bearing of someone who'd served on corporate boards since Victoria was in elementary school. His face was weathered, but sharp eyes that missed nothing and forgot less. He'd been her father's best friend, had voted to make her CEO over stronger candidates with more experience, and now looked like he was regretting that decision with every fiber of professional judgment he'd cultivated over 5 decades. Dominic Cross sat to Harrison's right, the power position, his laptop open and presentation ready. He looked composed, concerned, the picture of responsible leadership dealing with unfortunate circumstances. When his eyes met Victoria's, she saw triumph barely masked by appropriate gravity. Harrison called the meeting to order with formal precision. "We're here to address serious allegations regarding security breaches and unauthorized access to classified systems. Dominic, you called this meeting. Present your case." Dominic stood smoothly, commanding the room with practiced ease. His presentation appeared on the screen behind him, security camera footage from Lab 7 timestamps showing Victoria and Nathaniel working through the night access logs, proving they'd retrieved Sentinel's source code without following proper authorization protocols. Every piece of evidence was technically accurate context stripped away to create narrative of reckless CEO endangering company secrets. At approximately 12:30 a.m. CEO Victoria Blackwood granted Thomas Garrison unauthorized access to Project Sentinel's complete source repository. Mr. Garrison, as you know, was convicted of corporate espionage at Sterling Defense 7 years ago. His presence in our facility, much less accessing our most classified project, represents catastrophic security failure. Dominic's voice carried appropriate outrage mixed with sadness at having to report these facts. I believe Ms. Blackwood acted without malicious intent, but her judgment has been severely compromised by stress and grief following her father's death. This board has a fiduciary responsibility to protect Titan Defense, even when that means difficult decisions regarding leadership. Victoria watched the board members' faces, saw Dominic's narrative landing exactly as he'd intended. They were already convinced, already seeing her as unstable rather than ethical, as liability rather than leader trying to prevent catastrophe. Harrison looked at her with expression that suggested he'd already made his decision, but was extending courtesy of hearing her defense. Victoria, you'll have opportunity to respond, but first I want to understand why you gave Nathaniel Garrison access to Sentinel. What possible justification could there be? She stood, feeling her father's suit around her shoulders like borrowed authority, and met Harrison's eyes with the directness Donovan Blackwood had taught her meant more than polish. Because Nathaniel discovered that Project Sentinel contains 47 instances of deliberately embedded backdoor code that will allow anyone with the master key to override our defensive systems and take control of 500 military satellites. Because this exact vulnerability was present in Sterling Defense's CipherNet project 7 years ago. And because when Nathaniel tried to report it, then Dominic Cross destroyed his career to cover up the fact that he'd created the backdoor intentionally to sell access to foreign contractors. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the HVAC system's whisper and the distant sound of Manhattan traffic 45 floors below. Dominic's expression shifted to something between pity and frustration, the look of someone dealing with delusion that had progressed beyond reasoning. Victoria, these are serious accusations with no evidential foundation. You're claiming I deliberately sabotaged a military defense system. That's not just wrong, it's absurd. I have evidence. Victoria pulled up her phone, connecting to the boardroom display system. Code comparisons showing 96% architectural similarity between CipherNet and Sentinel. Independent forensic analysis confirming the similarities cannot be coincidental. Documentation of the LoopX protocol that Nathaniel warned Sterling Defense about in 2017, 3 years before you joined Titan and began developing Sentinel. The screen filled with side-by-side code highlighting matching functions and variable names. She walked them through the analysis methodically, showing how Dominic had copied Nathaniel's architecture wholesale while claiming original innovation. Showed them the simulation demonstrating how the back door could be exploited. Pulled up the tracing data indicating the master key's existence on Dominic's personal encrypted storage. The board members leaned forward, skepticism shifting toward concern as the technical evidence accumulated. These weren't stupid people, just people who'd been prepared to believe a narrative that fit their expectations. Given actual data, their engineering backgrounds started asserting themselves. Dr. Margaret Sullivan entered at Victoria's request, presenting her own analysis that confirmed the code similarities went beyond coincidence into systematic plagiarism. She'd brought documentation from Sterling Defense's archives obtained through old contacts who remembered when Nathaniel had been respected rather than convicted, showing CipherNet's original architecture matched Sentinel's core systems in ways that couldn't be explained by convergent development. Dominic fought back skillfully, questioning Margaret's methodology, suggesting that similar approaches to similar problems naturally produced similar solutions, pointing out that Nathaniel's testimony was legally compromised by the NDA from his settlement. But cracks were showing in his composure, the smooth facade developing stress fractures as evidence accumulated beyond what spin could deflect. Victoria called in Dr. Alan Wright via video conference, the forensic expert who'd spent 18 hours analyzing the code backups and produced a report that concluded with 99% confidence that Sentinel's architecture was derived from stolen intellectual property. Wright had testified in federal cases, had credentials that transcended corporate politics, and his technical breakdown of the plagiarism was devastating in its precision. Harrison stopped the presentation, holding up one hand for silence. His face had gone grave, the expression of someone watching foundations crack. Dominic, these are serious allegations with substantial technical evidence. Do you have explanation for why Sentinel's code matches CipherNet's architecture so precisely? LoopX is a theoretical framework multiple researchers have explored. The fact that similar optimization approaches produce similar code structures is inevitable given the constraints of the problem we're solving. Dominic's voice carried strain now, polish cracking to show calculation underneath. As for Mr. Garrison's accusations, he has every incentive to discredit me. 7 years ago, he tried to steal code from Sterling Defense. When he was caught, he blamed me rather than accept responsibility. Now he's using Victoria's grief and inexperience to resurrect the same false accusations. Except we have the master key location. Nathaniel spoke for the first time, his voice cutting through Dominic's deflection with quiet certainty. You stored it on encrypted cloud storage accessible through your company credentials. We traced the connection. And unless you can explain why Sentinel's source code references a master override key that shouldn't exist in a secure system, all your spin about theoretical frameworks becomes irrelevant. Dominic's expression froze just for a moment. But that moment told Victoria everything she needed to confirm. He'd believed the workstations confiscated from Lab 7 contained all evidence of their investigation. He'd assumed destroying the physical hardware meant destroying proof of the master key's existence. He hadn't anticipated Nathaniel's backup hadn't prepared for evidence surviving his careful evidence suppression. Show me this alleged master key location. Dominic's voice had gone cold, stripped of charm and concern, showing the calculation that had always been underneath. Because if you're wrong, if you're making accusations based on speculation rather than proof, you're committing defamation in front of witnesses. Victoria pulled up the tracing data showing the encrypted partition's location and the credential pathway linking it to Dominic's company account. The technical details were dense, but the conclusion was clear. A master override key existed. It was stored outside Titan's official systems, and it was accessible through Dominic's personal credentials in ways that violated every security protocol they'd established. Harrison studied the data, then looked at Dominic with expression that had shifted from friendly concern to prosecutorial assessment. Can you access this storage location right now? Show us what's there. The room waited. Dominic's jaw tightened fractionally, muscles tensing in ways that suggested he was running calculations and finding no good outcomes. Finally, that storage contains personal files unrelated to Titan business. I'm not required to share my personal data with the board. You're required to if it potentially contains evidence of security compromises in a military defense system we're about to deploy. Harrison's voice had hardened, shaped by 40 years of board governance, and zero tolerance for threats to companies he stewarded. Open that storage partition, Dominic, now. I decline. My personal privacy is forfeit the moment you used company credentials to access it. Harrison stood authority filling the room. This board has a fiduciary responsibility to investigate credible allegations of security compromise. Your refusal to provide access is noted and interpreted accordingly. Board members, I move that we suspend Project Sentinel's deployment pending independent security audit by external contractors with no connection to either Dominic or Victoria. Do I have a second? 6 hands rose immediately. Dominic stood abruptly, chair scraping against polished floor with sound like bones breaking. You're making a catastrophic mistake. Sentinel represents 18 months of development and $800 million in Pentagon funding. If we delay deployment, we lose the contract and Titan's reputation as reliable defense contractor. Better to lose a contract than deploy compromised system that becomes national security disaster. Harrison's voice carried finality of someone who'd made harder decisions and survived to know it was right. Motion carries. Sentinel deployment is suspended. Dominic, you're on administrative leave pending investigation. Victoria, you remain CEO but will work with external auditors to verify all systems. This meeting is adjourned. The board members filed out in shocked silence, the kind of quiet that followed when comfortable assumptions exploded and everyone had to recalibrate reality. Harrison remained seated, looking older, suddenly weight of what had almost happened pressing down on shoulders that had carried decades of corporate responsibility. Victoria stayed as well, too drained to move and too wired to rest. Nathaniel stood beside her, presence solid in ways that reminded her she hadn't fought this battle alone, even when it felt like isolation was the price of leadership. Harrison finally spoke, his voice carrying exhaustion that matched her own. Your father would be proud and furious that it came to this. His eyes found Nathaniel. I owe you an apology. We should have listened 7 years ago. I'm sorry we didn't. Nathaniel nodded acknowledgement but didn't speak, emotions too complex for words that would fit the moment. Dominic had left without speaking to anyone, his departure swift and silent, but Victoria knew this wasn't over. Men like him didn't accept defeat gracefully. They regrouped, found new weapons, came back harder. The battle was won, but the war continued. What happens now? Victoria asked the question that felt too large for simple answers. Now we do the hard work of verifying every system Dominic touched, rebuilding trust with the Pentagon and making sure this never happens again. Harrison stood slowly, joints protesting years of board meetings and corporate warfare. And you learn what your father knew. Leadership isn't about being right. It's about having courage to act when you don't know if you're right, but know you can't do nothing. They left the boardroom together, Victoria and Nathaniel and Harrison, 3 people bound by crisis, survived and work yet ahead. The sun was setting over Manhattan, painting the windows gold and red, and somewhere in Queens a 7-year-old girl was probably finishing homework and wondering when her father would come home. Victoria's phone buzzed, one final time, message from unknown number. This isn't over. You just made powerful enemies. D. She deleted it without responding because some threats didn't deserve acknowledgement and some battles had to be fought regardless of whether you could guarantee winning. The weeks following the board meeting moved with the strange dual quality of time when everything changed and nothing resolved. Dominic Cross disappeared from Titan Defense like smoke, his administrative leave transforming into resignation so abrupt that HR still hadn't processed the paperwork when FBI agents arrived with warrants for his personal devices and encrypted storage. The investigation sprawled across jurisdictions, federal prosecutors building cases that would take years to fully litigate, following money trails that led to encrypted accounts in countries that didn't cooperate with American law enforcement. and communication logs suggesting buyers Victoria didn't want to imagine having access to American satellite networks. The media seized on the story with predictable hunger. Defense contractor CEO exposes internal conspiracy. Brilliant CTO revealed as potential traitor whistleblower Janitor. Vindicated after 7 years. The narrative simplified complexity into digestible drama heroes and villains, carved from situations that had been mostly fear and uncertainty and people making decisions with incomplete information. Victoria gave exactly 3 interviews before her lawyers insisted she stop talking publicly about ongoing investigations. And each time she'd tried to redirect attention from herself to the systemic failures that had let Dominic operate unchecked for years. The reporters had edited those parts into footnotes. Nathaniel avoided cameras entirely uncomfortable with the label of hero that required ignoring how thoroughly Dominic had destroyed him the first time. He'd returned to his apartment in Queens to find job offers from 3 different defense contractors willing to overlook his sterling defense history. Now that the narrative had shifted 6-figure salaries and titles that suggested his exile might actually be ending. He'd declined them all, uncertainty about what he wanted mixing with exhaustion too deep for ambition to penetrate. Victoria stood at her office window 6 weeks after the board meeting, looking down at Manhattan at noon on a Wednesday when she should have been in budget review meetings, but had canceled everything to think through implications she kept trying to outrun. The independent audit had taken 38 days and cost Titan Defense $4 million. Every system Dominic had touched, examined line by contractors with security clearances and suspicious minds. They'd found 3 other vulnerabilities beyond LoopX smaller backdoors in peripheral systems. That suggested Dominic had been playing a longer game than anyone realized, building access points and control mechanisms across Titan's entire infrastructure. The Pentagon had suspended not just Sentinel but 2 other active contracts, their trust in Titan Defense shaken badly enough that Victoria spent half her seam in Washington reassuring generals and oversight committees that the problems had been isolated and corrected. The stock price had dropped 23% before stabilizing, analysts questioning whether the company could survive the reputational damage, regardless of what audits confirmed about current security. 3 board members had resigned, uncomfortable with the scrutiny and liability exposure, replaced by candidates Harrison Matthews recruited specifically for their ethical track records rather than their connections or corporate achievements. Her phone buzzed with a text from Harrison. "Redemption Lab proposal on my desk. Interesting approach. Let's discuss tomorrow." The proposal had been gestating since the week after Dominic's departure, born from conversations with Nathaniel about systemic failures that created people like Dominic and destroyed people like Nathaniel. The core concept was simple in theory, impossibly complex in execution. Establish a division within Titan Defense, dedicated to second-chance hiring, recruiting engineers who'd been wrongfully accused, pushed out of the industry for whistleblowing, or simply made mistakes that didn't deserve permanent exile. Give them mentorship, ethical training, real projects with real stakes, and create a pipeline of talent that understood integrity wasn't abstract principle but survival necessity. Victoria had drafted the proposal at 3 a.m. after another night when sleep felt like surrender pouring into the document, every lesson her father had tried to teach her, and every mistake she'd made by forgetting those lessons. The financial projections were aggressive but defensible. The ethical case overwhelming, the practical challenges enormous. It would require cultural transformation at a company that had spent 40 years doing things one way, would demand investment without guaranteed returns, would expose Titan Defense to criticism from competitors who'd argue they were just engaging in performative ethics while real business happened elsewhere. She'd sent the proposal to Harrison knowing he might dismiss it as distraction from more pressing concerns, but hoping the part of him that had been Donovan Blackwood's friend might recognize what her father would have wanted his company to become. Her office door opened without warning, Nathaniel entering with the comfortable violation of boundaries that came from shared crisis. He'd been spending more time at Titan Defense since the investigation concluded, helping audit teams understand Dominic's architecture and consulting on security protocols, paid as contractor rather than employee because he still wasn't ready to commit to anything permanent. His relationship with the building had shifted from janitor to specialist, people recognizing him in hallways and thanking him for preventing catastrophe they'd been too close to see coming. Lily wants to know if you're coming to her science fair next week. He carried coffee, one for himself and one for Victoria, that he set on her desk with the casual intimacy of someone who'd memorized how she took it. She's been working on a robot that detects security vulnerabilities in code. Very meta for a 7-year-old. Victoria accepted the coffee warmth, seeping into hands that had been cold despite the office temperature. What does this robot do when it finds vulnerabilities? Plays a warning sound and flashes red lights. Lily wanted it to explode dramatically, but I convinced her that property destruction wasn't the best solution to security problems. His smile was tired but genuine, the first real amusement she'd seen from him in weeks. Though given recent history, maybe she had a point about getting people's attention. They'd fallen into patterns over the past month and a half. Meetings that weren't quite professional and weren't quite personal, conversations that started with Titan business and drifted into territories that mattered more but felt more dangerous to navigate. Victoria was aware she was developing feelings that had no place between CEO and consultant attraction, built on shared trauma and mutual respect that would complicate everything if she acknowledged it directly. Nathaniel gave no clear signals about whether he felt similarly, or was just being kind to someone who'd fought beside him when fighting had been all they had. Harrison wants to discuss the Redemption Lab proposal tomorrow. Victoria kept her voice neutral, professional distance maintained through effort. I think he's actually considering it. Good. The industry needs something like this. Nathaniel moved to the window, standing beside her, looking down at the city that had chewed them both up in different ways. Though I'm not sure I'm the right person to run it. Every time someone calls me a hero or talks about vindication, I remember I'm only here because Catherine died and I had nothing left to lose. That's not exactly inspirational origin story. Victoria turned to face him directly, forcing him to meet her eyes. You're here because you chose to do the right thing twice, 7 years apart, knowing both times it would cost you everything. That's exactly the story people need to hear. People need to hear that doing the right thing destroys your life, and maybe if you're very lucky and someone powerful decides to believe you, you might get some of it back years later. His voice carried bitterness that had been building beneath the surface. Corrosive anger at injustice that vindication didn't actually erase. That's not hope, Victoria. That's just statistical noise. She wanted to argue, to insist that his story proved the system could work if enough people had courage to challenge it. But standing in her corner office with the city spread below them like conquered territory, she couldn't make herself believe the comfortable lie. Nathaniel had been destroyed by the system working exactly as designed, protecting power and profit over truth, and his eventual redemption had required extraordinary circumstances and luck he couldn't have counted on. Maybe the story isn't about the system working. Maybe it's about people refusing to let the system define what's possible. Victoria heard the words coming out and recognized her father's influence. The kind of idealistic pragmatism Donovan Blackwood had wielded like weapon and shield both. You didn't wait for vindication. You rebuilt from nothing. You raised Lily to believe broken things could be fixed. That's the actual story, and that's what Redemption Lab is supposed to teach. Nathaniel studied her for a long moment, expressions cycling through emotions she couldn't quite parse. Finally, "You sound like Catherine. She used to say that systems don't change themselves, people change them by refusing to accept what is as what must be." His voice softened with memory grief that would never completely resolve, mixing with something that might have been affection. "She'd like you. She'd appreciate that you put your career on the line for principle you didn't have to defend." The comment landed in territory Victoria didn't know how to navigate, acknowledgement of connection that felt significant beyond the words themselves. She opened her mouth to respond, but her assistant knocked and entered simultaneously, expression carrying the practiced neutrality of someone delivering news they knew would complicate an already complicated day. "Ms. Blackwood, there's someone in the lobby asking to see you. Sterling defense attorney. She says it's urgent and concerns Nathaniel Garrison." The room's temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Victoria and Nathaniel exchanged looks that communicated volumes. The past wasn't finished with them yet, and whatever came next would test whether their victory at the board meeting was real or just intermission. The attorney who entered Victoria's office 20 minutes later was mid-40s, expensive suit that managed to look both professional and vaguely threatening, briefcase that probably cost more than Nathaniel's monthly rent. She introduced herself as Claire Westbrook, General Counsel for Sterling Defense, and declined offered coffee with the briskness of someone on billable hours. "Mr. Garrison, 7 years ago you signed a settlement agreement with Sterling Defense. That included comprehensive non-disclosure provisions regarding CipherNet and all related projects." Claire opened her briefcase, extracting documents she laid on Victoria's desk with surgical precision. "Recent media coverage suggests you've been discussing those projects publicly, including specific technical details covered by the NDA. Sterling Defense considers this a material breach of our agreement." Nathaniel's face had gone carefully blank, the expression people wore when they'd been expecting punishment. And it was finally arriving. "I haven't given interviews. I haven't discussed CipherNet publicly. You've discussed it with Titan Defense executives, with board members, with FBI investigators. The settlement defines public broadly to include any disclosure outside immediate family members." Claire's tone was professionally sympathetic, regret performed for legal purposes. "Sterling Defense is prepared to pursue remedies including return of settlement funds, civil penalties, and cooperation with federal prosecutors who might be interested in your original conduct." Victoria felt rage building white hot and clarifying. "He exposed a national security threat. You're threatening him for preventing catastrophe your company failed to stop 7 years ago. We're enforcing a legally binding contract that Mr. Garrison signed voluntarily and benefited from financially." Claire's expression didn't change lawyers' comfort with morally questionable positions. "Sterling Defense has significant concerns about our proprietary technology being discussed in ways that could compromise our competitive position. The fact that similar technology appeared elsewhere doesn't void our intellectual property claims. Your proprietary technology was stolen by Dominic Cross and weaponized against American defense systems." Victoria kept her voice level through effort, every word measured to avoid saying things that would make the situation worse. "You want to sue the person who stopped that theft from becoming national catastrophe? We want Mr. Garrison to honor his contractual obligations." Claire pulled out another document, this one bearing intimidating official seals. "This is a cease and desist order requiring him to stop all discussion of CipherNet and related matters. If he complies immediately and signs an amended agreement strengthening the NDA provisions, Sterling Defense will forego pursuing damages. If he refuses, we proceed with full legal action." Nathaniel reached for the document, hands steady despite the color draining from his face. He read through it slowly, lips moving slightly as he parsed legal language designed to be comprehensible and intimidating simultaneously. When he looked up, his eyes had gone dead in ways that frightened Victoria more than anger would have. If I sign this, I can't testify in any proceedings against Dominic, can't discuss what happened at Sterling Defense, can't explain to future employers why my career has this 7-year gap. His voice was flat, emotionless. Effectively, I disappear again. Different terms, same result. You maintain your settlement funds and avoid additional legal liability. That's significant value. Claire's tone suggested she was being generous, offering mercy rather than delivering threat. Victoria stood abruptly, authority filling her voice with command learned from her father and refined through crisis. Get out of my office. Tell Sterling Defense if they pursue this, I will personally ensure every media outlet and Congressional Oversight Committee knows they're using legal intimidation to silence a whistleblower who prevented the exact security breach they enabled through negligence. Titan Defense will provide Mr. Garrison with unlimited legal support, and I will testify publicly about Sterling Defense's role in creating the circumstances that let Dominic Cross operate unchecked for 7 years. Claire's professional mask slipped momentarily, surprise breaking through calculated presentation. She recovered quickly, gathering her documents with efficient movements. Ms. Blackwood, I'd advise against making threats you can't follow through on. Sterling Defense has considerable resources and experience with litigation. You'd be exposing Titan Defense to significant legal risk for employee benefit that may not survive cost-benefit analysis. He's not an employee. He's the person who saved this company and probably saved lives. That's worth more than your cost-benefit analysis can calculate. Victoria moved to the door, opening it with gesture that made dismissal unmistakable. Tell your clients we're not intimidated, and tell them that if they want fight, we'll give them one that makes headlines they won't enjoy. Claire left with the practiced grace of lawyers who'd delivered ultimatums before and would deliver them again, unmoved by moral arguments that didn't appear in contract law. When the door closed, Victoria turned back to find Nathaniel sitting with his head in his hands. Shoulders curved inward like he was trying to take up less space in the universe. I can't let you fight Sterling Defense for me. His voice came muffled through his hands. They'll bury Titan in litigation. Discovery requests, depositions, years of legal warfare that will cost millions and distract from actual business. I'll sign their paper, go back to being invisible, and at least Lily won't lose her father to prison. Victoria sat beside him rather than returning to her desk, proximity feeling important. When my father was dying, he told me that legacy wasn't about what you built, it was about what you refused to compromise. He said the moment you start calculating whether principles are worth defending, you've already lost them. She waited until Nathaniel looked up, meeting his eyes directly. Sterling Defense's betting will back down because fighting is expensive and uncomfortable. They're wrong. Victoria, you don't understand what you're proposing. Nathaniel's voice carried desperation, fear breaking through the numbness. Legal warfare against a major defense contractor while Titan is still recovering from the Dominic situation, the board will never support it. Harrison will have you removed as CEO to protect the company. Then he'll remove me, but I won't let Sterling Defense destroy you for doing what they should have done 7 years ago. She heard the certainty in her own voice, understood she was committing to a path that would probably cost her everything she'd fought to achieve. Some battles matter more than winning. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications neither wanted to voice. Finally, Nathaniel spoke, words careful and fragile. Why are you doing this? We've known each other 2 months. You don't owe me this kind of loyalty. Victoria wanted to give him the strategic answer, the CEO explanation about corporate ethics and long-term value creation and moral responsibility to people who'd sacrificed for Titan Defense. but sitting beside him in her office with afternoon light painting Manhattan gold through the windows, she couldn't make herself deliver the comfortable lie. Because you're the first person in 10 years who's cared more about being right than being successful. Because Lily deserves a father who doesn't have to hide what he believes to survive. Because I'm tired of a world where people like Dominic win and people like you get destroyed for having integrity. She paused, vulnerability feeling dangerous and necessary. And because watching you choose to do the right thing despite knowing the cost made me remember why I wanted to work in defense technology in the first place before it became just quarterly earnings and board politics and trying to prove I deserved my father's job. Nathaniel was looking at her with expression she couldn't quite read, something between gratitude and fear, and the kind of cautious hope people developed when they'd been disappointed too many times to trust easily. He opened his mouth to respond, but Victoria's phone erupted with urgent buzzing, assistance number flashing, priority alert. Ms. Blackwood, FBI agents are in the lobby. They're asking to speak with you and Mr. Garrison. They say it's about Dominic Cross and they have new developments that require immediate attention. Victoria answered the summons with Nathaniel beside her, both of them moving through Titan Defense's corridors with the grim awareness that whatever came next was unlikely to be good news. Federal investigators didn't show up unannounced to deliver positive updates. They came when situations had escalated beyond what phone calls could handle, when putting bodies in rooms felt necessary to ensure cooperation or deliver threats with sufficient gravity. The FBI agents waiting in the conference room were exactly what Victoria had expected, mid-30s, dressed in suits that cost less than hers, but fit better expressions, carrying the particular weariness of people who'd seen enough corporate malfeasance to stop being surprised, but not enough to stop being disgusted. The senior agent introduced herself as Sarah Mitchell's Cyber Crimes Division with a partner named James Rodriguez, who looked like he'd rather be literally anywhere else. We've been tracking Dominic Cross's communications and financial transactions since his departure from Titan Defense. Agent Mitchell opened a laptop, pulling up files that made Victoria's stomach drop before she'd finished reading the first page. He disappeared 3 weeks ago. His apartment in Manhattan was cleared out, lease terminated, no forwarding address. Credit cards haven't been used since October 15th. His passport was flagged at JFK boarding a flight to Dubai, but he never arrived at the destination. Nathaniel leaned forward, professional instinct overriding personal fear. You're saying he's in the wind. We're saying he had resources and preparation we didn't anticipate. The encrypted storage you identified contained not just the master key for Sentinel, but contact information for 12 different foreign nationals, 6 of whom are on various watch lists for technology trafficking. Mitchell's fingers moved across the keyboard, pulling up photographs and dossiers. We believe Cross had been negotiating sales for at least 18 months, possibly longer. He wasn't planning to be caught, but he had contingency plans if exposure occurred. Victoria felt cold spreading through her chest, understanding crystallizing. He knew we might stop Sentinel's deployment. He prepared for that scenario, which means he has alternate plans that don't require access to Titan's systems. So correct. And those plans likely involve selling the backdoor architecture itself rather than access to specific implementations. Rodriguez spoke for the first time, voice carrying Texas accent and frustration. He can teach other actors how to build Lupex-style vulnerabilities into their own systems, turn it into a service rather than a single point of failure sale. The implications branched through Victoria's mind like malware spreading through networks. Dominic hadn't just been trying to compromise American defense systems, he'd been building intellectual property around vulnerability exploitation that could be sold to anyone with sufficient funding and insufficient ethics. He'd turned national security threat into entrepreneurial opportunity, and her exposing him had simply forced him to accelerate timelines and move operations somewhere American law enforcement couldn't easily reach. What do you need from us? Nathaniel's question was direct, stripped of hesitation or self-protection. Everything you know about how Cross operates, who he might contact, what resources he'd need to rebuild elsewhere. We're particularly interested in understanding his technical capabilities, whether he could recreate Lupex without access to your original documentation. Mitchell looked at Nathaniel with assessment that felt invasive. We've read the Sterling defense files. You're the only person who fully understood what Cross built. That makes you either our best asset or his biggest target. The words hung in air-conditioned silence, implications too large for comfortable acknowledgement. If Dominic saw Nathaniel as threat rather than defeated opponent, if he'd prepared contingencies that included eliminating the one person who could deconstruct his work, then winning the board meeting had just painted targets on people Victoria cared about protecting. You think he'll come after Nathaniel? Victoria heard her voice coming from distance. Professional composure cracking under weight of responsibility that felt suddenly overwhelming. We think Cross is sophisticated enough to understand that having Garrison alive and potentially testifying is problematic for his future operations. Whether he acts on that understanding depends on factors we can't predict. Mitchell's tone was carefully neutral, delivering worst-case scenarios without commitments to specific predictions. We're prepared to offer protective custody if Mr. Garrison feels threatened. Nathaniel shook his head before she finished speaking. I'm not putting Lily in protective custody. She's 7 years old. She's already lost her mother. I won't disrupt her life again because Dominic might be planning something. Then we recommend basic security protocols, awareness of surroundings, reporting suspicious activity, keeping communication devices charged and accessible. Rodriguez pulled out business cards, sliding them across the table. Call this number if anything feels wrong. Don't wait to be certain. We respond to paranoia better than we respond to casualties. They left the conference room 30 minutes later with more information than Victoria wanted and less reassurance than Nathaniel needed. The FBI's investigation continued. International cooperation requests filed with countries that might or might not honor them. Digital forensics teams analyzing Dominic's communications for patterns that might reveal where he'd gone and what he was planning. But the underlying message was clear. They were dealing with someone who'd been preparing for exactly this scenario, and preparedness mattered more than righteousness when outcomes were measured. Victoria insisted on driving Nathaniel home, arguing over his objections until he accepted with exhausted surrender. The drive to Queens took an hour through rush-hour traffic, giving them time to process implications neither wanted to voice directly. Dominic wasn't just gone, he was actively dangerous in ways that transcended corporate revenge, and the people Victoria cared about were vulnerable in ways she couldn't protect through boardroom authority or legal threats. Mrs. O'Brien was waiting on the stoop when they arrived. Lily beside her, working on homework with the focused intensity children brought to tasks they found genuinely interesting. She looked up when Nathaniel approached, her face lighting with uncomplicated joy that felt like reprieve from complications they'd been drowning in all day. Dad, I finished the detection circuit. Want to see? She was already pulling him toward the apartment, talking rapidly about resistors and voltage regulation and how she'd figured out the warning light system through trial and error that had blown 3 LEDs before she got it right. Victoria watched them disappear inside Nathaniel's posture, relaxing fractionally as Lily chattered about robots and science fair preparations. This was what he'd been fighting to protect, not his own reputation or career prospects, but this moment of normalcy where 7-year-old girls could be excited about circuits without knowing their father had been threatened by corporate lawyers and warned by federal agents in the same afternoon. Mrs. O'Brien studied Victoria with eyes that had seen too much life to be fooled by polite masks. You're the one who's been helping Nate fight his battles. He's been fighting his own battles. I just provided resources. Victoria felt uncomfortable under that knowing gaze, aware she was being evaluated according to criteria that had nothing to do with quarterly earnings. Resources matter. So does choosing to provide them when easier options exist. Patricia moved closer, voice dropping to conversational intimacy. He's good man who's had terrible luck. Doesn't deserve more trouble. You planning to be part of solution or part of problem? The question was direct enough to bypass corporate diplomacy and strike at core concerns Victoria had been avoiding examining. Her relationship with Nathaniel, professional collaboration, friendship, attraction she wasn't acknowledging existed in undefined space that would eventually require definition. She could stay in that space safely, maintain boundaries, protect herself from complications that came from caring too much about someone whose life intersected with hers, through shared trauma rather than shared interests. Or she could acknowledge that 2 months of crisis had created connections that mattered more than safety, that Nathaniel had become important to her in ways that transcended strategic value, that watching him parent Lily with patient dedication and refuse to compromise principles despite costs had reordered her understanding of what she wanted from life beyond corporate achievement. I'm trying to be part of the solution. I'm not always sure I know how. Victoria met Patricia's eyes directly, offering honesty rather than polish. But I'm not planning to walk away just because the situation is complicated. Patricia nodded slowly, assessment apparently satisfied. Good. That girl needs more people in her life who choose to stay. And Nate needs someone who understands why he makes choices that don't look smart from outside but are only choices he can live with. She retreated to her apartment, leaving Victoria standing on the sidewalk, considering whether to follow Nathaniel inside or return to Manhattan where crises awaited her attention. The decision felt weighted with implications beyond immediate logistics. Question of whether she was visitor in his life, or participant observer of his struggles or ally in fighting them. Her phone decided for her Harrison Matthews, calling with urgency that suggested postponing wouldn't be option. Victoria, I just got off phone with Sterling Defense's CEO. They're threatening massive lawsuit over your interference with their legal matters. What exactly did you say to their attorney? Victoria stayed on the sidewalk watching traffic pass while she explained the situation as clinically as possible. Sterling Defense using NDA to silence whistleblower threat to expose Nathaniel's cooperation with FBI. Her response that Titan would provide unlimited legal support. She heard herself delivering the facts and recognized she'd crossed lines Harrison had probably hoped she'd respect but couldn't make herself regret the choice. Harrison was silent long enough that Victoria thought he might be composing firing speech. Finally, your father would have done exactly the same thing, probably with more profanity but same basic approach. Relief flooded through her, unexpected and destabilizing. You're not telling me to back down. I'm telling you to be strategic about how we fight. Sterling Defense has resources and motivation. We have righteousness and public relations advantage. Those don't balance equally, but we can make them expensive enough that settlement becomes attractive. His voice carried the careful calculation of someone who'd fought corporate battles before. I'm also telling you that the board is watching. Not everyone agrees with your approach. You're spending political capital you might need later. I understand, but I can't let them silence him for doing what was right. Victoria watched Nathaniel's window, seeing shadows moving behind curtains that suggested father-daughter time continuing without her. Harrison, if it comes to choice between protecting Nathaniel and protecting my position as CEO, I'm choosing him. I need you to know that. Another long silence, this one carrying different weight. I was your father's friend for 40 years. I watched you grow up. And I'm telling you that Donovan would be proud you're willing to sacrifice position for principle, and he'd also tell you that sacrificing position means you can't protect anyone when you're unemployed and discredited. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting you let me handle Sterling Defense's legal threats while you focus on building coalition within Titan to support Redemption Lab proposal. Show the board that principles translate into profitable innovation. Make your idealism strategic rather than just expensive. Harrison paused, considering words carefully. And maybe be honest with yourself about whether you're fighting for Nathaniel Garrison the whistleblower or Nathaniel Garrison the man you're developing feelings for. Because those are different battles with different implications. The observation landed with uncomfortable accuracy, exposing concerns Victoria had been deliberately not examining. Her connection to Nathaniel was complicated by everything power differential, shared trauma, professional entanglement. And underneath it all, the growing certainty that she cared about him in ways that transcended crisis response, and ventured into territory where feelings mattered more than strategy. I'll focus on the Redemption Lab coalition. Trust you to handle Sterling Defense. Victoria kept her voice professional despite personal territory Harrison had opened. Thank you for not firing me. I'm not thanking you for making my job harder, but I'm also not firing someone for having integrity. That would be ironic given current circumstances. He ended the call, leaving Victoria alone with rush hour traffic and decisions that felt simultaneously obvious and impossible. She climbed the stairs to Nathaniel's apartment, knocked softly, and found herself invited into domestic scene that existed entirely outside corporate warfare and legal threats. Lily had spread her science project across the kitchen table components and wiring, creating controlled chaos, while Nathaniel helped troubleshoot a connection that wasn't conducting properly. They worked together with easy collaboration, father teaching daughter through questions rather than answers, letting her figure out solutions while providing just enough guidance to prevent frustration. Victoria watched from the doorway, understanding with sudden clarity that this was what mattered more than board meetings or legal victories or reputation management. This moment of teaching and learning of family built from loss and determination of 7-year-old girl, believing she could build robot that detected security vulnerabilities. Because her father had shown her that fixing broken things was possible, even when everyone else said they were permanently destroyed. Lily noticed her first waving with enthusiasm that suggested Victoria's presence was expected and welcome. Ms. Blackwood, you came back. Want to help test the detection system? I'd love to. What do you need me to do? Victoria pulled up chair, joining them at table covered in circuits and dreams. Dad says all code has patterns, good patterns and bad patterns. My robot learns good patterns, then beeps when it sees bad ones. Lily's explanation was simplified but fundamentally accurate, demonstrating understanding of concepts graduate students struggled with. But I need to teach it more patterns so it gets smarter. Can you show me bad code? Nathaniel caught Victoria's eye over Lily's head expression, mixing pride in his daughter with awareness of irony. They were teaching 7-year-old to detect security vulnerabilities that had nearly destroyed national defense systems, turning trauma into pedagogy, making sure next generation understood stakes before they made choices that couldn't be unmade. They spent 2 hours teaching Lily's robot about loopx patterns, breaking down the vulnerability into components simple enough for child's mind to grasp while sophisticated enough to actually detect problematic structures. Lily absorbed information with frightening speed, asking questions that revealed deeper understanding than her age suggested possible, already thinking about edge cases and false positives with instincts that suggested she'd inherited both parents' analytical capabilities. When Lily finally went to bed, exhausted by learning and satisfied with progress, Nathaniel and Victoria remained at the kitchen table, surrounded by evidence of successful teaching, and aware they needed to address topics that had been hovering unspoken all day. Sterling Defense will probably back down once their lawyers explain what fighting would actually cost them. Nathaniel spoke first, addressing practical concerns rather than emotional ones. They're trying to intimidate, not actually pursue. Bad publicity from silencing whistleblower is worse than whatever competitive damage they think I could cause. Harrison agrees he's handling their threats while I focus on internal coalition building. Victoria traced patterns on the table's surface, finding easier to look at wood grain than Nathaniel's face. He also pointed out that I'm spending political capital protecting you that I might need later for other battles. He's right. You should let Sterling Defense have what they want. I'll sign their amended NDA, testify in whatever constrained way they permit, and we move forward with minimal additional damage. Nathaniel's voice was resigned, shaped by years of accepting outcomes he couldn't control. You've already done more than anyone should expect. Victoria finally looked up, meeting his eyes directly. What if I don't want to do what's expected? What if I want to fight battles because they matter, not because cost-benefit analysis suggests they're strategically sound? Then you become unemployed CEO who fought noble fight and lost ability to protect anyone because you confused principles with practical reality. His words were harsh, but tone was gentle concern rather than criticism. Victoria, you can't save everyone. Sometimes choosing to save yourself means you live to fight battles you can actually win. Is that what Catherine would tell me? The question came out before Victoria could censor it, driven by frustration and fear and need to understand. How someone as principled as Nathaniel had survived this long without becoming cynical. Nathaniel flinched at his dead wife's name, grief that would never fully heal showing on his face. When he spoke, his voice was soft, remembering. Catherine would tell you that some people are worth more than strategic calculations can measure. She'd say that if you spend your whole life protecting your position, you wake up one day realizing you don't remember what you were protecting it for. He paused, swallowing hard against emotion. She'd also tell you that I'm probably not worth the trouble I bring, but she'd be grateful you're trying anyway. Victoria felt something shift in her chest walls she'd built around herself since her father's death, cracking under pressure of accumulated feeling. You're worth the trouble. Lily's worth the trouble. Building a company that actually serves principles instead of just claiming them is worth the trouble. She took breath, committing to vulnerability that felt terrifying and necessary. And I think I'm fighting for you not just because it's right, but because these past 2 months working beside you have reminded me that there are people in the world who choose integrity over comfort, and I want to be someone who protects those people rather than someone who calculates whether protecting them serves my interests. Nathaniel was staring at her with expression she couldn't quite read, surprise and caution, and something that might have been reciprocal feeling if she let herself believe in possibilities beyond professional collaboration. He opened his mouth. Closed it, tried again. Victoria, I'm 7 years past career destruction, raising daughter alone in apartment that's always one emergency away from crisis, being threatened by former employers and hunted by criminal. I helped expose. I'm not in position to offer you anything beyond complications. I'm not asking you to offer me anything. I'm telling you that complications don't scare me as much as spending the rest of my life choosing safety over things that actually matter. She held his gaze, refusing to look away despite discomfort. I'm telling you that I care about you and Lily in ways that transcend professional boundaries, and that scares me more than sterling defense or board politics or anything else I've dealt with. But I'm choosing to say it anyway because Catherine was right that some things are worth more than strategic calculation. The silence that followed felt infinite, stretched between them like gap too wide to cross or invitation to try. Finally, Nathaniel stood, moving around table until he was beside her, and his hand found hers with tentative certainty that suggested he'd been wanting to reach for her, but hadn't let himself believe it was permitted. I care about you too. I've been trying not to because it felt unfair to bring you deeper into life that's mostly wreckage, but I'm tired of pretending you're just CEO who happened to believe me when no one else did." His thumb traced across her knuckles, gesture intimate enough to make her breath catch. "Catherine's been gone for years. I didn't think I'd feel this way about anyone again. Definitely didn't expect it to be someone who could fire me." Victoria laughed, despite weight of moment tension breaking into something warmer. "I can't fire you. You're consultant, not employee. Even better, makes the power dynamic slightly less ethically concerning." He was smiling now, tentative, but genuine. First real happiness she'd seen from him since before FBI agents had delivered warnings about Dominic. "Though I should probably disclose that Lily has been planning our wedding since approximately the second time you came to dinner. She's been practicing flower girl duties in her room. 7-year-olds are optimistic." Victoria felt warmth spreading through her chest, possibility taking shape in space where fear had been dominating. "Though I should probably disclose that I've been thinking about what it would be like to be part of your family since watching you teach her about circuits. You're remarkably good at making disaster look like normal life. Years of practice. Necessity is effective teacher." He squeezed her hand, gently grounding gesture that suggested he needed the contact as much as she did. "Victoria, I don't know how this works. You're CEO of major defense contractor. I'm guy who cleans offices and occasionally prevents national security disasters. There's no roadmap for this. So we make it up as we go. Figure out boundaries and balance and how to build something that matters to both of us." She stood closing distance between them until they were face to face, close enough that she could feel his breath and see the hope mixed with fear in his eyes. "I'm good at building things from scratch, and I think you are too given what you've constructed from wreckage." He kissed her, then tentative and careful and sweet in ways that made her understand why romance novels existed, because some moments transcended description and required direct experience to comprehend their weight. His hand cupped her face, gentle despite calluses from labor that required physical strength, and she let herself lean into the contact, accepting comfort from someone who understood cost of choosing principle over profit. When they broke apart, both slightly breathless and aware they'd crossed threshold. That would change everything. Nathaniel's expression had shifted to something between wonder and terror. "Lily's going to be insufferable about this. She's been telling everyone at school that you're going to be her new mom." "I'm not trying to replace Catherine." Victoria needed to say it clearly, establish boundary that respected grief that would never completely resolve. "You're not replacing her. You're being yourself, and that's someone Lily already loves in her own way. Someone I'm learning to love despite knowing better." He kissed her forehead, tender gesture that suggested affection beyond physical attraction. "Catherine would approve. She always said I needed someone stubborn enough to fight beside me, instead of someone who'd let me make martyrdom into identity." They talked until midnight, building framework for relationship that existed outside normal professional or romantic conventions, negotiating boundaries and expectations with honesty that felt both uncomfortable and necessary. Victoria would maintain her position as CEO, continue fighting battles that needed fighting. Nathaniel would remain consultant, building Redemption Lab into reality, protecting Lily from worst of the complications their lives entailed. And together they'd figure out how to be people who cared about each other despite power differentials and media scrutiny and all the reasons. Relationship between CEO and whistleblower was probably a terrible idea. When Victoria finally drove back to Manhattan at 1 a.m., exhausted and exhilarated and terrified in equal measure, her phone buzzed with message from Harrison. Sterling Defense agreed to mediated settlement. They drop NDA enforcement. We agree not to publicly criticize their handling of CipherNet situation. Nathaniel can testify freely. Well played. She read the message 3 times, understanding that victories accumulated slowly, that battles won through coalition building and strategic patience rather than dramatic confrontations. Harrison had been fighting for her while she'd been discovering feelings for man whose life she'd chosen to protect, and both efforts had succeeded in ways that felt simultaneously fragile and permanent. The next 6 months transformed Titan Defense in ways that would have seemed impossible during Dominic's tenure. Redemption Lab launched with 12 engineers, people who'd been wrongfully accused or pushed out of industry, or simply made mistakes that didn't deserve permanent exile. Nathaniel led the program with a combination of technical expertise and ethical clarity that made it immediately successful, teaching approach to engineering that prioritized integrity over innovation for its own sake. Lily became youngest person ever admitted to Titan Defense's youth engineering program, spending Saturdays learning from professionals who treated her insights seriously despite her age. Her security vulnerability detection robot won first place at District Science Fair, attracting attention from universities already discussing early admission programs that would fast-track her toward career in field her father had almost abandoned. Victoria's relationship with Nathaniel remained carefully private, both aware that media would turn their connection into narrative about CEO dating whistleblower that would obscure more important work they were building together. But Titan Defense's employees noticed how she smiled more, how meetings with Redemption Lab ran long because conversations ranged beyond business into philosophy and ethics, and what it meant to build company that actually served principles it claimed. The Pentagon eventually renewed Titan Defense's contracts after independent audits, confirmed all vulnerabilities had been identified and corrected, though at reduced scope, that reflected continued caution about trusting contractor that had nearly deployed compromised system. Stock price recovered slowly, analysts uncertain whether Redemption Lab represented legitimate innovation or just expensive performance of ethics that wouldn't survive next quarter's earnings pressure. Dominic Cross remained fugitive, Interpol notices filed and occasionally updated when intelligence suggested he'd been spotted in Dubai or Singapore or Moscow. FBI maintained active investigation, building cases against buyers who'd shown interest in Lupex architecture, but Dominic himself stayed ahead of law enforcement through resources and sophistication that suggested he'd been preparing for this outcome much longer than anyone realized. On a Friday evening, 14 months after Nathaniel had smashed Victoria's laptop, and everything had changed, they stood together in Lab 7. Now Redemption Lab's primary facility transformed from dusty abandonment into vibrant workspace, watching Lily demonstrate her latest project to a group of impressed engineers. The security detection robot had evolved into something approaching functional AI, learning patterns from massive dataset and identifying vulnerabilities with accuracy that rivaled professional tools. Lily presented with confidence beyond her years, explaining architecture and methodology in terms that revealed deep understanding of principles most engineers took years to internalize. When she finished, the room erupted in applause, recognition of achievement that transcended her age and suggested future brilliance in field that desperately needed ethical practitioners. Victoria slipped her hand into Nathaniel's gesture, casual enough that watching engineers might miss significance, but intimate enough that both felt connection. He squeezed gently, acknowledgement of moment they'd built together through crisis and determination, and refusal to accept that doing right thing required sacrificing everything else. "She's going to be better than both of us." Nathaniel's voice carried pride mixed with appropriate humility. "Better engineer than I was, better leader than Dominic could have been if he'd chosen differently. She gets to start from place where she understands ethics matter, not because consequences force recognition, but because foundation was built right from beginning. That's the actual legacy." Victoria watched Lily accept congratulations from engineers who'd learned from her father, saw a future taking shape in 8-year-old girl who believed broken things could be fixed because she'd watched her father prove it true. Not quarterly earnings or Pentagon contracts or stock price recovery. This. Creating next generation that doesn't have to learn ethics through catastrophe. They stood together while Lab 7 filled with conversation and laughter, while Lily chattered about next projects and impossible dreams, while engineers who'd been given second chances built work that mattered beyond profit margins. Manhattan glittered through floor-to-ceiling windows, all those towers of ambition and compromise, and somewhere in that vast city, Nathaniel's apartment in Queens still held Catherine's photographs and memories that would never fade but had made space for new family being built from wreckage. Victoria's phone buzzed one final time, message from board chair announcing quarterly results revenue. Up, investor confidence restored, Redemption Labs' reputation attracting talent from across industry who wanted to work somewhere that valued integrity over optimization. Numbers that would have been only thing that mattered 2 years ago now. Just confirmation that doing right thing occasionally produced outcomes conventional wisdom said were impossible. She showed Nathaniel the message, watched him read with expression that suggested satisfaction without triumphalism. Understanding that battles were never truly won, just progress toward better circumstances than existed before. He pulled her closer, kiss on forehead that felt like promise and acknowledgement both, and whispered something Catherine had told him years ago that now felt prophetic. Broken things can be fixed if you understand the system well enough and care enough to try. Broken people work the same way. Lily noticed them standing together, waved with enthusiasm that suggested she'd been right about wedding plans all along, and returned to explaining robotic architecture to engineers who'd learned humility was prerequisite for excellence. The evening stretched ahead with promise and work yet to be done, with relationships still being defined and companies still being transformed, and world outside that would always present new crises requiring courage. Neither of them had known they possessed until necessity forced discovery. Some battles were worth more than winning. Some people deserved protection beyond what strategy suggested was rational. Some principles mattered enough to sacrifice everything else. And discovering you weren't alone in believing that made the sacrifice feel less like loss and more like investment in future worth building. Victoria Blackwood and Nathaniel Garrison stood together in Lab 7 on Friday evening, watching 8-year-old girl demonstrate that tomorrow could be better than today if enough people chose to make it so. And both understood they'd been fighting for this moment since laptop shattered on marble floor, and everything impossible became inevitable instead.